My fiance is a demon. How do I know? Well, I'm the one who summoned her, and she's actually pretty sweet once you meet her. I've never been attractive or had a way with women. That's why I've decided to summon one for me, but she loves me dearly anyway. However, there are rules to keep the relationship healthy. If you intend on bringing a special lady from another plane to yourself, please follow these rules. Number 1. Overlook the bloody smell in her breath. Yeah, I know the metallic nuances are not the most pleasant once you kiss a pretty girl, but believe me, there are far worse scenarios. Don't complain and if you do, immediately get on your knees and apologize. You have to be very clear that you don't want to have your nose ripped off to solve this problem. She's gonna ask. Number 2. Never say she's eating too much. She eats how much she wants to eat. An important thing is keeping your sweetheart happy. Remember, you have to be grateful that she's not eating your obnoxious and fat mother or that delicious looking nephew that stained my dress, in her words. Number 3. Don't comment on her limitations. Being an immortal being from another plane, she's obviously has no time to learn our significant routines, so it's natural for her to have a hard time dealing with Amazon orders. And you will have a harder time losing your eyesight for a week after mocking her for that. Number 4. Don't ask for her to get a job. You have to provide for the woman you love. My fiance is actually quite progressive on gender equality, but it doesn't work for her. She was once hired to work at retail and ate 5 customers. To be fair, they asked to talk with her manager, which is Satan, so she took them there. But her helpfulness can be easily misunderstood. She was fired in her first day after working just for 2 hours, so just be careful with that. Number 5. Don't get curious about her girl nights. Sure, like every young woman, your demon girlfriend will have a group of female friends. They go out regularly and have fun, just like girls do. Never ask what they're doing during the hangouts. Respecting boundaries and privacy is important, even if, coincidentally, every time they go out, a major tragedy like a huge fire or plane crash happens. Number 6. Don't make her stay in crowded spaces. Love is all about renounce. You're gonna have to stop going to all those concerts you like, unless you don't mind a few people being eaten in front of you. But the screams really spoils the music. The poor thing is quite claustrophobic, so the subway's out of the question. Always get an Uber. If worse comes to worse, at least you will only have eaten 1 person instead of 50. Don't be a scrunch. Number 7. Don't look a second time when you see a beautiful woman. She'll know, even if she's not with you at the time. You'll know from the burning sensation in your penis and other private parts. Number 8. Don't ever pet sit for your friends. Yeah, dogs are adorable, but this is for their own good. Their tender meat is your second favorite, and cats will try to bite her face because they know better. Number 9. Don't lie to cover for your friends cheating. Demons are very serious on sorority, except with the ladies whose souls they have eaten, of course. So they'll end up hurting both you and your scumbag friend. It may be the poor girl that decided to sleep with a guy knowing he had a girlfriend if she's not feeling much of a woman's right advocate. Number 10. Don't ask for a break. Demons are actually too loving, so this hurts her feelings deeply, especially if you try to undo their summoning. Besides, if you wanted a break, you could have just asked her to lock you in the underworld for 3 entire nights. It's plenty of time to think and decide you were crazy to even consider being apart from her. Lastly, number 11. Graciously accept your luck. You're gonna help bring to this world a powerful kid, a cute little half demon with your half genes. You don't need any other joy besides giving your useless body and soul to feed both the woman you love and your offspring. So, there we go. A few years ago, my friend John asked me a simple question. Have you heard of the mirror game? Of course, I didn't know what he was talking about. It seemed to be one of those questions where the inquirer just asks because they wanted to tell you about it. He always asked me about obscure movies and songs, always aware that I didn't know any of them. That was just the way he was. So when he asked me about the mirror game, I had taken it as just another one of his obscure references, nothing more than a book or movie that never made it big. I haven't heard about it. What is it? I asked him. He grinned at me, and I'll show you. He got up from his chair and went to dim the lights. Then he left his room, only to return with a knife and a handheld mirror. Whoa, what do you have the knife for? I asked. Don't worry, it's not for cutting yourself if that's what you're wondering. He sat the mirror on the table and handed me the knife. Before we start, there are some rules that you absolutely need to follow. I nodded. Go ahead. First rule, never let go of that knife. No matter what happens, do not drop it until you hear me say the special word. What's the special word? I will tell you after I finish the rules. Don't interrupt. I roll my eyes, and he glares at me. I mean it. If you don't take this seriously, then forget I said anything. Don't treat it like a game. It's called the mirror game, though. I thought it was a game. That's just what it's called. I didn't name it. I guess it's a game, but it's still a serious game. Now let me finish. The next rule is do not say the special word out loud, or even think about it. Do not even mouth the words or write it down. Bury it in the depths of your mind. Don't say it, even if I ask you what the word is. The third rule. Don't go too far from the mirror. You don't have to pick it up and carry it with you, but try to always stay within sight of it. If you lose sight of it, don't panic. Just calmly but briskly walk to where it is. Last rule. Remember that you are doing this. Sometimes I forget I'm playing the game, but I look at the knife I'm holding and remember I have to go back. When you're playing it, it's almost like it tries to make you forget what you're doing. What type of game is this? I know there's a lot of rules, just repeat them for me so I know you got them all, Josh said. Hold onto the knife at all times until you say the word. Don't even say or think about the special word. Stay close to the mirror. Remember, I am playing a game. Not a game. Remember, you're playing the game. Okay, so what's the word? He turned the mirror so that it was facing down on the table and leaned close to my ear. He whispered so quietly that I almost didn't hear him. Alorius. I nodded. Repeat the word, he said. You just told me not to in the rules, I replied. It was a test. You passed. Good job. He then put the mirror back so that I saw my reflection in the dim light and stared into it. I'm going to walk you through it, and when it's time to come back out, just repeat the steps. It will be a bit different when you do it by yourself, but just remember that you stare into the mirror itself, not your own reflection. It shouldn't take as long though. I'll take a deep breath in. Stare into the mirror. I began staring into the mirror as he said. I also began to question his sanity a bit. I mean, who would even come up with this stuff? 5 minutes into the staring contest between myself and the mirror, I began noticing strange things. My body started to tingle slightly, and my reflection began to look more transparent. Josh, is it normal to see changes in the mirror? Yeah, it's normal. I gripped my knife harder. I was staring so deeply into the mirror, it felt as though I was getting pulled into it. Josh? I called out. What the fuck? I heard from his kitchen. It was my voice. How is that possible? I whispered to myself in shock. Hey, who are you? The other me yelled as he walked towards me. I held the knife out, almost dropping it because of how my hands were shaking. Don't come any closer, I yelled. Tell me what's going on. The other me stood still, hands in the air. Why didn't you tell me? This is my house. My vision started to go dark around the edges. I was hyperventilating. I needed to calm down. Go back into the kitchen, I yelled. The other me slowly walked away, hands still in the air. As soon as he left my side, I looked in the mirror and tried to focus. Josh hadn't explained how to get back. Then I remembered from the other side. Alorius. It was hard to concentrate when I was so focused on the other me being somewhere behind me, but I eventually felt that pull and realized I was back on my side of the mirror. Josh, I yelled. He looked at me and smiled. Trippy, right? I dropped the knife and punched him hard in the jaw, causing him to fall over. What the heck was that? Hey, relax, he said, scrambling away from me. What do you mean relax? You could have killed me. Get out of my house. Wait, don't you want to know what that was? You should have told me what that was before sending me there, you asshole. Would you have gone if I told you what it was? Would you have even believed me? It doesn't matter. Why would you even think of doing that to someone, especially a friend? I didn't think you would get so angry. You're right. You didn't think. Let me just explain, okay? We've got 2 minutes. He sighed. I found the game online. I thought it looked kind of fun, but I didn't think it'd work. When I did it for the first time, I did it alone. It's a bit different when you do it that way. Harder to come back. I actually didn't realize I had crossed over until I noticed myself standing behind me. We talked for a while, but he was acting really weird, so I went back to my side of the mirror. I did it a few more times as the days went on, and I realized that he was trying to get on this side of the mirror. I haven't done it since. I think you get about 5 times to do it. Maximum 10 times each before they start to try to trick you into staying on their side of the mirror. Explain more. Oh, well, he would try to get me to watch a movie or go outside for a walk with him. He wanted me to get as far away from the mirror as I could. Did you happen to look outside at all while you were there? I don't think so. Trust me, if you did, you would know. The outside is weird in that place. It looks normal at first, but the farther you look from the mirror, it's just really creepy. What do you mean? It looks unfinished, like a sketch. Actually, exactly like a sketch or rough draft. I looked out of the window and the end of my street was white like paper and the houses were inked outlines. He really wanted me outside. I think he wanted me to get outside the house so he could run back and lock the door for full access to the mirror. Why wouldn't you tell me that before sending me over there? You wouldn't have gone. Thanks for explaining. Take the mirror out of my house and don't ever come back. Come on, don't you find it interesting? No. He looked disappointed, but he took the mirror and left. I haven't seen him since. Sometimes I wonder if he played the game again and got stuck inside the mirror. I've moved on with my life, and I hope he has too. But every once in a while, I swear my reflection has a mind of its own. Let me cut to the chase and just catch you up on what's happening so far. This house is haunted. I don't know how the heck anyone managed to sleep at night here and call themselves a human being. We moved in just last Monday and I knew something was up. I've always had a sixth sense about this sort of thing. One time my wife and I spent an anniversary at a hotel and we just changed rooms 4 times because I felt something was wrong in each suite we stayed in. Turned out I was right. Either a murder or some weird scandal had happened in each one of them. His property was no different, but we didn't have a choice in the matter. I won't go into too many details, but our fiancés have been very tight lately, so this is all we could afford. Anyway, back at the ghost thing. Our youngest, Kylie, is the first that had an encounter. That was Wednesday. She said someone was in her attic, but we told her that there is no attic. Well, I hear someone walk around my ceiling then, she snapped. I decided to take her word for it and check. And wouldn't you know, there was some residue from a shoe on the ceiling. How the hell it got there, I don't know, but I was convinced that something was wrong, especially because of what happened next. My children had nightmares about the basement before it was unlocked. When we got the property, we were told there was a wine cellar. Nothing out of the ordinary, and actually sounded like something we had always wanted. There was a lock on the door which the real estate agent admitted they didn't have the key for. I'm sure if you use something strong you can get it open though. Just no one has ever really had much use for the space down here, they said. I knew something was off. I could feel it. My skin was crawling as I looked towards the basement door. There were about 4 steps that jutted downward and then ended abruptly in a short hovel. Probably older than a house itself. It didn't look pleasant or friendly. It looked like it was meant to stay locked. My wife was immediately intrigued by it though. I bet there's some great Sangio or Syra down there. I can borrow my dad's drill and get that open in no time, she said. I had a bad feeling, especially when both Callie and Adrian had dreams about the basement. Adrian was first. He has always had an avid imagination. After Callie had reported that she was sure people were walking on the ceiling, he couldn't sleep and came to bed with us. That resulted in a night where no one got any rest because he kept waking up and screaming. "What has gotten into you?" I asked. I keep hearing something under the floor. It's getting into my skin," he would tell me frantically. He said there was something that was growing under the house. In one dream, it was a weed. The next, it was an octopus. Either way, it was unsettling. He had never had strange dreams like this before. Still, my wife was now even more curious because of the nightmares. "If there's something about the basement, I want to know what it is," she decided. Audrey has always been a bit stubborn. I told her to leave it alone. My hope was that maybe if we ignored the otherworldly presence in our house, it would get tired and move on. That didn't happen. Something in the basement doesn't want us to leave. It was Saturday when Audrey finally found the way to open the door. I didn't even know she had gotten the drill. I had to go to work that day, and by the time I got home, she was already in the basement. I remember walking in and announcing to the kids that I was home. Normal Saturday afternoon would mean they were either playing outside or on their Xbox. But this time, the house was empty and quiet. I immediately felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up as my first thought went to the basement. Sure enough, I saw that the door was slightly ajar, but I couldn't see anything beyond the fourth step. It seemed like it plunged straight into the darkness. I was just about to walk down there and see if she was maybe sorting through whatever might be below when I had second thoughts. A sense of foreboding overwhelmed my body, and instead I decided to call her cell phone. I heard it ringing below my feet. Then I heard Adrian make a giggle from the stairs, and I turned towards the basement door and called out to them. "Hey, don't scare me like that," I shouted. No response. It made me uneasy. I tried to call again and it rang and she didn't respond. "Adrian, tell your mother to come up, and you too. Where's Kelly?" I asked. "We're all down here," he responded. Something in his voice was off. It was chilling. "Okay, well, are you coming up then?" I asked. No. A short answer. Something was wrong. "Adrian, listen, I need you to come upstairs." "Why don't you come downstairs, Father?" he asked. That didn't sound like my son at all. I looked down into the stairwell and saw two glowing orbs, which I assumed were his eyes. I couldn't see his pupils, just those white circles. I tried my best not to be frightened as I spoke. "How long have you been down there?" I asked. "Long enough," he responded. I took a tentative step towards him. "You really need to come up now. All of you, it's not safe down there." He smiled and I could see his teeth. It made the rest of his shadowy face look inhumane. "Are you sure it's safe up there?" he whispered. I didn't take any more steps towards him. I knew this was wrong. I felt cold talking to him, like it was just an empty void. That was Saturday, and I waited an hour before I was sure that they weren't coming back up. I then tried and told them again to come up and got the same response, except this time from my daughter. "Daddy, I like it down here too." "You will too," she said in a hum. I didn't know who to call or what to do. It's not like the police were going to come over for something like this. I kept hearing scratches on the floor and it would keep me awake. I've never felt so watched as I stayed in bed, like there were eyes on the floor below. Then Saturday came and I went to work, trying desperately to ignore the sense of dread building inside me. I would get texts from my wife every so often. "When are you coming home? The kids miss you. I miss you, of course, too. We need to be a family together. We have to stay together as a family." That prompted me to respond. "And stop this foolishness and come upstairs." "It's you who's being the fool here, John." I decided to stop reading the text after that. When I got home, the house was quiet again and I didn't even go near the stairs. I grabbed some sleep meds and locked myself in my bedroom, hoping that the night would pass quickly. Now it's Tuesday and things have progressed worse. A lot worse. "We're hungry, Daddy. Can you please come feed us?" Kelly whispered to me as I passed the stairs this morning. I called a few people in the area, spiritual leaders and such, hoping maybe they could give some advice. As you might imagine, no one wanted to talk to me. They thought I was crazy. Maybe I am. I didn't think it would be possible for something so simple to be so sinister, but it is. And I'm terrified because I don't want anything harmful to happen to my family. Why don't you come up and eat, baby? I asked my girl. We can't. It won't let us leave. As if I already didn't have confirmation that something was happening down there, this sent shivers across my spine. And you can't leave either, my wife added. I saw all three of them there, 3 pairs of eyes in the darkness staring up at me. Just come down here, John, Andre insisted. I took a step towards him, my heart racing. Something was compelling me to go deeper. Take one more step. Just do it, John. Just do it. And I heard this low growl as I reached for the door. It was like the house settling and preparing to swallow me whole. I slammed the door and caught my breath, refusing to go a step further. For a moment there was silence. Then I heard a soft noise on the other side of the door. Tap, tap. I ignored it at first. Tap, tap. I bit my lip and whispered, "Who's there?" There was a giggle mixed with that hellish growl. "Daddy, it's me. Please open the door. Pretty please." I was visiting a childhood friend a few weeks ago who we will call Steve. And after reminiscing on the past for a while, we've decided it was time to drink. We bought a cooler into the large property he had bought off his parents. This was the same place he grew up and I would often visit, so we knew the path to go down. We had a specific place in mind. When we were kids, we explored this property all over, pretending like there were monsters in the forest and scavenging for makeshift tools. Of course, a fort or base was high on the priority list. So when we found what appeared to be a doomsday-style bunker, we quickly established this as a new hangout spot. Eventually, we even got the generator in there to start working, and we would just watch movies and hang out. However, as we became teenagers, it also became a place to hide away alcohol and drink without his parents finding out. Even though we were now adults and Steve owned this property, there was something nostalgic about going into the bunker to hang out. We talked for a while, but at some point he had to go back to the house, but assured me he'd be back in a few minutes. Considering it's about a 15-minute walk, I knew it would be a while. So while he was gone, I decided to go into the bunker and see if everything was still working. As I climbed down the ladder, the dust and cobwebs told me that it had been a minute since he had been down here. However, I eventually found the generator and some remaining gasoline in a container and started it up. The lights came on and I realized he must have not gone in here since we were teenagers. The steel chair setup was the main area with the television and VCR player hooked up. The storage area had plenty of old MREs and astronaut food, covered in a thin film of dust. I walked over to the VCR and noticed there was a dusty box next to it with several movies. As I shuffled through them, I came across a tape with black Sharpie on it, labeled "Those Things I Fear." I had no recollection of watching this, or even what it could be. However, I figured it was just some obscure horror film and I was pretty bored. I put the tape into the VCR and turned on the television, wiping the screen off so I could actually see. The tape showed just a black screen for about 15 seconds before an image came on that appeared to be a security camera from the upper corner of a room. There was a format for a time and date, but it appears to be random numbers. In the room there was a television and a couple of chairs. As I watched with curiosity, I noticed in the background a ladder come down. Then 2 teenagers began to climb down and then sit down in the chairs. As I continued to watch, my blood ran cold. Those kids were me and Steve, but he had never been recording as far as I know. I look up to where that camera would have been in the upper corner of the bunker. No camera or any sign of a camera being there. I ejected the tape and shut off the bunker before heading back to Steve's house. I found him slumped on this couch, clearly unable to walk. "Hey Steve, did you have cameras set up in the bunker when we were kids?" I asked him, unsure if he was in any state to respond. "Camera? No man, why would I put cameras in there?" Steve responded, not giving it much a thought. Steve responded, not giving it much thought. "Well, I found this tape and put it back," Steve interrupted with a sudden sense of soberness in his voice. I began to respond when he stood up suddenly. "Listen to me carefully. Put it back where you found it and come back to the house." I nodded and headed back down the trail to do what he said. I wanted to question his strange reaction, but something told me he was right. At this point, I felt like eyes were on me from all directions as I made my way back through the woods. I finally arrived at the bunker and placed the tape back on the box, then headed back. Steve didn't want to talk about it at all, and we hung out for the night, and the next day I returned home, forgetting about the experience entirely. I tried to chalk it up to some sort of weird prank, but that didn't seem too convincing of a theory. But either way, I pushed it out of my mind, getting back to my everyday life. That was until a week later. I had gotten home from work early that day when I decided to check my mailbox. I found a package with no return address. When I opened it, all that was inside was a VHS tape. It labeled, "Those Things You Fear."
My wife and I had just sat down to dinner when we were interrupted first by the sound of the front doorknob twisting, then by 3 loud knocks. I stood up from the table and went to the front door, wondering who would have tried the knob first before knocking. My brother maybe, but it was a little late for a visit from him on a weeknight. The sound of the rainstorm outside grew as I opened the door. When I saw her standing on the porch, covered in rain and mud, my heart nearly leapt out of my chest. "Hi, Daddy," Sarah said. The way her eyes and nose were scrunched up told me she was crying, even though the rain washed away her tears the second they fell from her eyes. "Can I come inside? It's cold." I heard some glass shatter in the kitchen, then rushed footsteps. I grabbed my daughter in a tight embrace and began to sob. "Oh my God, you're home," I said. 3 years ago, we had reported our daughter missing. We told the police that we had put her to bed one night, and the next morning she was gone. The police found that her bedroom window showed evidence of having been pried open. My wife, Hannah, and I hadn't heard anything that night. The neighbors all agreed they hadn't either. What happened next was the largest search party in our small town's history. It's not even 13-year-old girls going missing, especially under such terrible and mysterious circumstances. But despite everyone's best efforts and news reports throughout the state and neighboring states, there was no trace to be found of our little girl. I picked her up and carried her into the house while she sobbed into my neck. I heard my wife turn the corner and let out a small scream and then join us in our first complete family hug in 3 years. "What happened?" Hannah asked. "Did anyone follow you here?" "No," Sarah said throughout her sobs. I don't know what happened. I just woke up in the dark and started trying to find my way home. I don't know where I was, something in the desert I think, and I just started walking." I set her down and looked at her again. Her hair was long. It probably hadn't been cut since the night we lost her, and the clothes she wore looked like they had been given to her by a homeless person. Let's get you to a hot shower," my wife said. "Are you hungry?" Sarah sniffed and nodded. "Can I have a peanut butter sandwich?" "Anything," my wife said, now choking back tears of her own. "I can't believe you're back." We dressed her in some of Hannah's old clothes, which were still a little large for Sarah. I promised to go to the store first thing in the morning to buy a whole new wardrobe. The rest of the evening was spent with tears and laughter. Hannah and I couldn't believe she was back, and with no recollection of the time between the night she disappeared and when she woke up. Perhaps that much was for the best. After Sarah was asleep, we put her in the office with an air mattress and promises of a new mattress along with her new clothes. I sat outside on the patio with a glass of bourbon in one hand and a cigarette in the other. My wife came outside and softly closed the door behind her. We sat in silence for a moment, and then she finally spoke. "What the hell do we do?" Her voice was low and shaky. I shook my head slowly and took a long drag of my cigarette. "I have no idea." "Thank God she doesn't remember anything," Hannah said, taking a sip of the wine she'd bought with her. You know, you don't think she knows, do you? Shush, I said sharply, trying to keep my emotions level, which was difficult because I was on the brink of panicking myself. We shouldn't talk about it. She took a sip of her wine and lowered her voice even more, so it was just barely above the sound of crickets chirping in the grass. You don't think she can hear us, do you? I don't think so, I answered slowly. But I didn't think a lot of things before, and look at what happened. We sat again in silence for a long while, both reflecting on the night she disappeared and the lies we told to every police officer and news reporter that came our way. Keeping the lies straight hadn't taken months of practice, but somehow we pulled it off. But that wasn't even the hard part. The hard part was keeping the whole plan away from Sarah. The year or so we'd spent planning the whole thing in secret, talking to the neighbors to keep their cooperation, all while doing our best to keep the life-changing event as far as out of our minds as possible. She's bound to find out what we did, Hannah said. We're not so good at keeping things away from her as we used to be. It's just like riding a bike, I said, hoping more than anything I was right. The fact of the matter was that 3 years ago, Hannah and I had committed the unforgivable act of filicide. We'd killed our own daughter. The very one that was now 3 years old and slept on an air mattress inside. That wasn't bad enough. Shortly after doing so, for good measure, we had moved across town to get a fresh start, and although we never said it out loud, even to each other, because we were still terrified, even though she was gone, we were careful not to list our address on anything. No yellow pages, no direct mailing, nothing. And yet, Sarah still managed to find us. We hadn't wanted to do it. We spent years convincing ourselves that we were in control, that it was just a matter of good parenting. After what happened to the Jarvis boy, though, we knew that for the sake of ourselves and everyone around us, there was only one thing to do. I took another drag of my cigarette. I hadn't realized until that moment that my hand was shaking, and stared out at the night sky, trying not to think about everything that led up to that night, but being able to think of nothing else. Sarah was a beautiful, smart, and happy little girl. As new parents, everything we did revolved around her. I couldn't wait to get home from work just so I could hold her. Hannah, as exhausted as she was, loved the late night feedings because she got extra time with the baby. We bought toys and clothes for her every time we ran to the store. We were completely under her spell. Which is why we found it so strange that very few people actually wanted to interact with her. Both our mothers came down to visit during the week after Sarah was born, each simply bubbling over with excitement about meeting their new granddaughter. But neither of them stayed in the house for more than an hour, and only 5 minutes or so was spent holding the baby. Strangers would actively avoid looking at her, and nobody, not once, ever stopped us to say how adorable our baby was. We hadn't noticed these things at first. The things our mothers had definitely rubbed us. It rubbed us the wrong way, but the avoidance of public, the sideways glances from people at the store, the way our neighbors never seemed to visit anymore, all took time to finally come together to form the complete picture. People simply wanted nothing to do with Sarah, and for no reason at all that we could understand. We took her to the doctor on a regular basis to track her growth and development, and every time the doctor and nursing staff would do everything they could to get in and out of the room as quickly as possible. Eventually I brought it up that they always seemed to be in a rush, and although the doctor fed us a lie about how busy he was, the nurse told me after he left that the room felt weird. She said she had no idea why, but when she walked into the room, she was reminded of when she was a little girl and had to go fetch something for her mother from the basement. She said profusely that it was nothing to do with us or our darling little girl, but Hannah and I had begun to suspect the truth by that point, and we knew that the nurse was just being polite. I'd be lying if I said this didn't bother us, but we told ourselves that people would come around eventually, and if they didn't, then forget them. It was when Sarah was around 3 that we began to feel ourselves that there was something different about her. We'd long since come to terms with the fact that she made people feel uncomfortable, but it was at this time we actually dipped our toes into that pool. Anyone who had been around toddlers can attest that even the best behaved children can be a handful at times. They want to be independent, they want to make their own decisions, but even lack the skills to do so. Although there was a lot that seemed different about Sarah from the beginning, this was not one of those differences. She yearned for independence and defiantly disagreed with just about everything we told her. This went on for some time, and Hannah and I were beginning to approach a method of maneuvering around these disagreements when Sarah threw us a curveball that changed everything. She started arguing and throwing fits before we had even said anything. Hannah first noticed it during an argument with Sarah over what we were having for dinner. I was still at work while Hannah was working out whether we should have grilled chicken or pork chops. She had gotten up to open the freezer when Sarah came running over to the kitchen and said she didn't want chicken or pork chops, she wanted pancakes for dinner. Hannah laughed us off and told Sarah that we'd have pancakes another night, which of course quickly turned into stomping feet and red-faced tears and a timeout in her bedroom. Hannah had told me later that night that the strange thing that struck her wasn't that Sarah had known what she was about to do, but it was a peculiar feeling she got just before it happened. She said she felt a strange sense of unease wash over her, like she imagines a gazelle gets when it senses a lion approaching. I felt the same thing while I was changing the oil in the car a few weeks later. I had forgotten to grab the fuel filter wrench and was about to slide out from under the car to get it when I was suddenly shrunken by an overwhelming sense of dread. I quickly slid out from under the car, worried that the jack would fail and I'd be crushed when I saw Sarah approaching me with the tool in her hand. She smiled and said, "Here you go, Daddy." Holding back a shudder, I thanked her, kissing her forehead, and she went back into the house to watch cartoons. The past couple of days after Sarah arrived back have been some of the most stressful days of our lives. We've done everything we can to be the parents she remembered us as to be, and not the parents who had killed her and left her body in the desert. The hardest part is that we can't even think about that night or how terrified we are. We have to keep thinking about how happy we are to have her home and how sad we had been when she was gone, and there was absolutely no margin for error. Sarah's story, as she told us over breakfast, was full of blind spots and holes. She remembered sitting down to dinner with us. She had picked up burgers from her favorite restaurant down the street, and she remembers us going to bed. But after that, it's all completely blank. The next thing she recalls was stumbling around naked in the desert, finding a road and eventually being picked up by the driver and given a ride to the truck stop, 25 miles away from where she stayed the night. The next morning, she started off to find us. She didn't tell us how she found us, and we didn't ask. I'm not sure she would be able to answer the question, and if she could, I don't think I would want to know the answer anyway. Hannah and I took turns spending time with her while the other went out under the guise of running errands, picking up clothes, ordering a bed, and buying groceries. But the honest truth was that we needed to distance ourselves from the constant trum of unease that followed Sarah wherever she went. Even when she was younger, sleeping in the same house as Sarah was difficult, especially with that distinct feeling of impending danger spread thin across every room. We hadn't always felt that way, but the older she got, the more that feeling deepened. Now that she's 16, and we're out of practice, the feeling is almost unbearable. We feel like mice trying to rest while a cat sleeps across the hall. After what happened last night, we know that the nights are going to be significantly worse. I hadn't been asleep for long before I was startled awake by a loud thump. Hannah awoke as well, and we sat up together, searching the bedroom for the source of the sound. I was reminded vividly of a night where Sarah was 10 or so, and a few birds had petaled the house, waking us up in similar fashion. Sarah had feigned innocence. She'd been quiet all afternoon, and Hannah and I suspected that She had a run-in with some of the neighborhood kids early that day. Another loud thump shook the house, and it was a hollow, hard sound, like a fist pounding on our bedroom wall. We exchanged a look, then quickly got out of bed and went to the room next door where Sarah slept. My heart pounded in my chest as we both paused before opening the door. We knew that nothing good could come out of opening the door, but the alternative could be far worse. Another loud thump, then another. Then they were getting faster, and there was a strange crackling sound that came with the last one that turned my pulse up another notch. I threw the door open and flipped on the light. I first noticed that Sarah's bed was empty, then that she stood with her back against the wall of this room shared with our bedroom. She had a twisted grin on her face that was so tight it looked painful. The tendons in her neck stood out like cords, and her throat bulged from the pressure of it all, but the smile stopped at her mouth. Her eyes looked like they had been made of glass. We stepped into the room, and Sarah thumped the back of her head hard against the wall. The crackling I'd heard had been drywall, and that I now saw breaking from the spot where her head collided and speckling her bare feet with dust. "Sarah, what are you?" Hannah asked, but was cut off by another thump, then another. Sarah sped up, hitting her head against the drywall as fast as she could. I rushed over to her and pulled her away. Her body was rigid but relaxed as I laid her back down on the air mattress. She looked up at me then. The glass in her eyes was gone, and for a brief moment I could see my baby girl in them. Seeing the faint reflection of the past in those eyes made my heart feel like it was weighted by a ton. The moment passed and her eyes grew their hard look again. It was a cold, unfeeling look that I had seen unwavering since the incident with Preston Jarvis and those horrors that came into the weeks that followed. It was a look that ultimately led us to commit our own unforgivable sin. "My head hurts, Daddy," she said in a small voice. "I know," I told her. "What were you doing?" "I had to get them out," she said. "What?" I asked. "The memories." Sarah was 6 when we first saw her strange talents affect the physical world. Until that point, it seemed that whatever she could do was strictly tied to an ethereal plane. She could change our emotions and read our minds to a certain degree, but she certainly wasn't bending spoons or levitating off the ground. Either of those would have been preferred. It was sometime in July, and the weather had turned from warm to hot. The dog days of summer were upon us. A scream and a crash from the kitchen destroyed whatever tranquility had been in the house that day. I came running into the room to find Hannah precociously balancing on the counter and a glass of iced tea smashed on the floor. She saw me and immediately pointed to the stove. "It went under there." "What did?" I asked. "The mouse." I laughed and earned daggers from Hannah's eyes. She'd never been one to cope well with household critters. "Look at a trap." Just before I turned to go fetch a mousetrap, I saw a black blur bolt from beneath the stove. Hannah shrieked again, and I went for the broom that hung in the closet next to me. Before I could do anything else, the mouse stopped suddenly in the middle of the floor. With the broom in hand, wondering if I could somehow sweep it out of the house, I approached the rodent. As I got closer, though, I noticed it wasn't moving. Its ribs weren't expanding and contracting the way they do with little animals, nor was its head twitching around as it searched for a place to hide. In fact, this mouse wasn't even standing. I tapped it with the bristles of the broom carelessly, and Hannah let out an audible shudder. "Calm down," I told her. "I think it's dead." "Dead? It just died." "Yeah," I said. "I think so." I knelt down to get a closer look. I looked up and saw Sarah staring at us from the hallway. She had this look in her eye, one I would come to see often in dread. Even that first time, it made my blood run cold and sent chills down my spine. "Sarah?" I said carefully. "Are you alright?" She looked at me and the look was gone, melted away to expose the happy face of a little girl I loved so dearly. "Yeah, Daddy. Now that mouse won't scare Mom anymore." I looked at the dead mouse, then back at my daughter. Did you do something to the mouse? Yeah. Her answer was so cold, so casual that it gave me goosebumps, just like I do to the spider sometimes. I stood in shocked silence for a minute, which Sarah took as her cue to return to whatever she'd been doing in her bedroom. Hannah slid from the counter and stood next to me for several minutes before she asked a question that had been floating in the back of my mind, but hadn't yet come forward. When was the last time you saw a spider in the house? I started, then stopped. I don't know. After the incident with the mouse, Hannah and I took special care to teach Sarah right from wrong. She seemed to grasp the concept that hurting anything was wrong, and it was especially wrong to kill things. We'd ask her to never do what she did to the mouse again, and to try to focus on doing good with her talents. We weren't entirely sure what she was capable of doing, so trying to give her examples of good things she could do was a bit difficult. For the most part, we just hope she didn't do anything without our consent. After we'd gotten used to the uneasy feeling we'd gotten whenever she peeked into our minds, we started playing guessing games. This allowed her to stretch her muscles in a manner of speaking and allowing us to pick up on subtleties we otherwise would have been blind to. Hannah and I learned that Sarah could pick up on what we were thinking, but only what we were actively thinking about. If there was a secret we didn't want her to know, we could keep it from her by keeping a song in our head or thinking about work. This skill, which we initially used to keep Christmas and birthday presents secret, would become vitally important and likely save many of our lives years later. Outside of home, things were significantly different from Sarah. Very few people got used to the way she made them feel. That inescapable feeling of danger looming that she seemed to exude was difficult to ignore. It took several years, but eventually our neighbors did start coming around again. Bob, an elderly man across the street who lived for his rose bushes, was the first person outside of Hannah and myself to really open up to Sarah. With a wife who had passed away 3 years prior and his only grandkids living only 2 states away, it surprised nobody to see that he and Sarah found solace in each other's company. Like all the other neighbors, Bob politely declined any invitation to our house regardless of the weather. He never spent too much time with Sarah, but if she was playing alone in the front yard, as she often did, it wouldn't be long before Bob came shuffling over with a bag of taffy or an ice cream bar in his hand for her. He'd give her a crooked grin, tell her not to spoil her dinner with it, and would walk back across the street to trim his rose bushes or fertilize his lawn. Had this unlikely friendship not come into existence, Hannah and I would probably have not known about the incident with Bear, the Rottweiler that lived down the street. The neighborhood children were often cruel to Sarah, which sadly surprised us very little. Hannah and I did everything we could to mitigate it. We talked to Sarah about it as often as we could. We told her that she was loved no matter what the other kids said. But at 8 or 9 years old, the isolation from her peers was devastating. The other kids' parents were of little to no help either, being as difficult or more than their children. Eventually, Sarah learned it was best to keep to herself, which worked for the most part. It was October, and the leaves were changing, and there was a crisp chill in the air that made us all crave pumpkin spice and apple cider. Halloween was a week or 2 away, but the spirit was alive already, especially for the children in the neighborhood who rode their bikes up and down the street, smashing pumpkins and doorbell ditching helpless victims. Sarah, of course, never participated, which was just fine by us concerning the trouble the other kids got into. 3 of these kids lived down the street from our home: Austin Francis, Kenny Ryan, and Preston Jarvis. And they were the worst offenders. If I found eggs in my house, it was one of those boys. If Hannah found the garden torn up, it was one of those boys. If Sarah was being picked on in front of the yard, it was one of those boys. They were like a small pack of hyenas, laughing to themselves and wreaking all sorts of havoc. Hannah was doing laundry in the basement, and I was at work that day in October when 3 boys came riding down the street on their bikes, hootering and hollering like they did back then, one of them carrying a leash attached to a particularly mean Rottweiler named Bear. Sarah had been decorating the driveway with sidewalk chalk, when the boys rolled up and stopped at the curb. "Hey, you freak," Kenny called out. "What you doing?" Sarah didn't respond. "Hey," Preston said. "We asked you a question." Sarah, again, said nothing. Austin took a step forward, unzipped the front of his pants, and let forth a stream of urine all over the chalk drawing Sarah had been working on. Sarah stood up and took a step back to avoid the pee, and Austin sprinkled the pile of chalk she'd been using just for good measure. As this back and forth went on, or maybe just back, because at this point there was no forth, Bear grew more and more agitated. Sarah had never been in any luck with animals, most avoided with her more than people did, but Bear was a nasty dog without any additional pouting. He'd charged a fence at anyone who passed his yard, snarling and growling and slamming his considerable weight against the chain link, making everyone on the other side of that fence immediately nervous. There was even a rumor that the Ryans had to pick their mail up from the post office because the mail carriers refused to deliver to that address anymore. Noticing this agitation, Kenny called out to his friends, "Hey, look at Bear. Even he hates her." The dog was pulling at his collar and snarling at Sarah now, large ropes of saliva hanging down from his jaws. "Looks like he wants to get off that leash," Preston said. "I say we let him go and have at whatever's pissing him off." Preston went over to the dog, who was pulling so hard at the leash now that Austin was leaning backward to keep control of him. It was at this point that Bob, who had been watching the scene unfold from his front yard, decided he needed to step in, not knowing that he wouldn't get past the end of his driveway before it was all over. Sarah stepped forward, still saying nothing, and the boys instinctively took a step back. Bear, however, inched forward, the muscles in his neck and chest flexing as he pulled the boy on the other end of the leash along. Sarah took another step forward, now less than a foot away from the beast that waited more than she did, and that was when the dog stopped snarling. He still pulled at his leash, but the fight had left him. Instead, he pulled and twisted his neck in the way of a dog attempting an escape from a collar. Bear pulled harder, and the links of the metal choke collar broke, tingling against the ground like lost change. The entire time, Sarah's blank gaze followed Bear. Although he'd felt fear countless times throughout his life, Bob admitted later that watching this play out, and especially seeing the cold, dead, predatory look in Sarah's eyes was the first and only time he'd ever experienced real, unadulterated terror. Bear only got a few feet away before the orange and white blur of an oncoming U-Haul truck collided with it, and the Rottweiler was no more. The driver leapt out of the cab, and the rest of the scene unfolded as one would expect, with the exception of Sarah, who picked up her piss-covered chalk and returned to the picture she'd been working on, while screams and apologies and tears went on behind her. Moments later, Hannah would hear the commotion and come outside. Bob would call me a day later and tell me what he'd seen. He'd tell me how frightened he was and how strangely the dog had moved when it made its final footsteps, like a puppet on a string. A week after that, Bob would come outside to find 3 of his biggest, healthiest rose bushes looking black and brittle while Sarah stood motionless, watching him from her bedroom window. To say that Sarah was different after the incident with the Rottweiler would be a gross understatement. The darkness in her eyes that visited from time to time had taken up residency, only leaving for brief moments to remind us of our little girl still existed. We took her to several therapists, hoping that perhaps with professional mental help, she could overcome whatever demon she was battling inside her, and that we'd finally get our little girl back. What we got in return were conflicting diagnoses: psychosis, bipolar disorder, depression, ADHD, schizophrenia to name a few, and a constant wave of referrals. Sarah would barely get 2 or 3 appointments out of the same therapist before being recommended to another more qualified practitioner. Some would even just stop showing up at all and refuse to return our phone calls. After a couple of years of this, Hannah and I had ultimately decided to forego therapy and focus on learning what we could on the subject ourselves. The constant loss of people in her life was doing far more harm than good. Given the juggling act of therapists, requests for her to change teachers in school mid-year, and the lack of friends, I can't say I was surprised to see Sarah shut down, and it broke my heart. The bullying tapered off for a while after the demise of Bears, but children are quick to forget, and it wasn't long before the abuse from other children started up again, and with a ferocity that both terrified and infuriated us. Hannah and I did everything we could think of to protect Sarah from the barrage of hate, and to protect the other children from suffering unimaginable consequences. We practiced breathing exercises. We taught Sarah how to get help from adults, specifically adults who were required to intervene, and how to get herself away from these situations. Always vigilant, Hannah and I would drop off Sarah at school or take walks around the neighborhood to see other children in casts, braces, and crunches, and we would wonder why so many of them had been genuine incidents, and how many had pushed Sarah too far. There certainly seemed to be more injuries than seemed normal. It was foolish to assume Sarah hadn't played a part in at least a few of them, no matter how often we practiced self-control with her. Of course, we couldn't ask Sarah about it. We couldn't even think about it around her. We told ourselves it was because we wanted to avoid isolating Sarah more than she already was, which was absolutely true, but the whole truth was that we were also afraid of her turning on us. She seemed so volatile that a wrong word or wrong thought could push her over the edge. For better or worse, we didn't have to bring it up because her involvement in the mysterious neighborhood injuries was all but confirmed over the course of a few months, when the three boys from down the street, Austin, Preston, and Kenny, all managed to find themselves in casts with broken bones and were suddenly too busy to care much about picking on our daughter. If I'm being honest with myself, I was glad to see those boys laid up for a bit. Sarah's wrath had been a long time coming, and if I could have gotten away with smacking those boys around a bit, I probably would have. After some time passed, Hannah and I had noticed that one of the three boys was missing. Although Kenny and Preston still came around on occasion to throw rocks at the house or yell profanities at Sarah as she sat outside, Austin was nowhere to be seen. Fearing the worst, we started asking around the neighborhood about the boy. Neither Hannah nor myself had a good rapport with Austin's parents. I'd nearly come to blows with his father over the incident with his dog, so walking down the street and knocking on the door wasn't really an option. The Francis family had moved a few weeks prior from the woman who lived next door. Nobody knew why they'd moved, but nobody really had a great relationship with that family. Randall Francis was an alcoholic, and Lauren Francis was a chain smoke drug addict. Nobody in the neighborhood was sorry to see their house vacant. After a year later, the Ryan family moved in, leaving Preston and Jarvis alone to pick on Sarah. Having now lost his two best friends to cross-country relocations, Preston's own isolation made him even meaner and more cruel towards Sarah. Perhaps if his friends had been around, things would have gotten different for Preston, although that was far out of his control. The Preston Jarvis incident, as it would forever be branded in my mind, occurred on July 4th, 2019. The three of us had spent the morning with the rest of the town on Main Street for the annual Independence Day parade. Sarah hadn't wanted to go, but had been a good sport about it at least. These days, she kept almost entirely to herself, only really coming out of her room for meals and to go to school. Every free moment she had was spent with her nose in a book, enjoying the escape to distant lands where children were nice to each other and villains got their own commitments. Hannah and I encouraged this as much as we could, while also trying to promote social growth, which was as difficult as it was terrifying, but also equally as necessary. Sarah had brought along a novel called New Moon, the second book in her favorite series that she'd finished several times already, and together we enjoyed the sun and the food and the sights offered by the parade. We'd gotten a few smiles out of her, a rare occurrence these days, so Hannah and I were taking the day as a win. That was until Preston Jarvis rolled up on his bike. He'd been bold to bully Sarah in front of us before, but today he must have been feeling especially brave. "Hey there, freak," he called from the curb. "Why don't they put you in a cage and parade you around this year?" "Get the freak out of here," I retorted. "It's your fault she's such a freak anyway. Your whole family is probably a bunch of devil worshippers. That's what my dad says anyway. I think we'd be all better off if you were all dead." I stood from the camping chair we brought with us and walked the few feet that stood between us. "Listen here, you little crap," I said between my teeth. "I don't give a freak what you or your dad thinks. Come around my family again and I'll put you in a hospital." He looked at me for a beat, then opened his mouth to reply. His eyes shifted then to Sarah, and his expression turned to a mixture of fear and hatred. Then his mouth closed and he rode off down the street. I sat back down, expecting to be chastised by Hannah for threatening the kid, but got nothing other than a sideways look. "You alright, kiddo?" I asked Sarah. I couldn't be sure from where I sat, but I thought I could see the shadow of a smile on her lips. "Yeah," she answered. "I think it'd be better off if he were dead." Hannah and I exchanged a look of concern. "I don't think so," Hannah said, always a mitigator. "I think his family would miss him. We may not like him, but there's plenty of people that do, and they would be sad if something happened." Sarah nodded in response, more of an acknowledgement than agreement, and went back to her book. Later that day, we found ourselves at the park to enjoy the firework display the city put on. We'd enjoy as much as we could from the crowds during the parade, so that night we'd hung back a quiet bit from where the main groups were. Hannah and I sat on the park bench enjoying the hot dogs while Sarah sat under a tree working on her fishing book before the sun finished setting. Just as I swallowed the last bit of the hot dog, I heard a hissing sound and felt a rush of warm air on my cheek. Bang! A bottle rocket exploded near the tree where Sarah sat. I whipped around and was unsurprised to see Preston Jarvis 10 feet away, aiming another bottle rocket at us. He lit the rocket, and moments later, it flew past me, hitting the tree Sarah sat against and exploding. I stood up, and Preston knew he only had a few seconds before I knocked him to the ground. He bent over and picked the largest out of the pile of fireworks at his feet. It was significantly larger than the ones he had shot at us, and lit the fuse. Before I could get close enough to stop him, the firework went off. It fired several shots, one after another, turning our small patch of park into the scene from the war movie. The hot rockets hit my back and showered me in ash and spent gunpowder. I looked up and saw that several of the fireworks had hit their target. Sarah was wiping embers off of her face and out of her hair while her book smoldered at her feet. After the firework was spent, smoke and the scent of sulfur hung in the air like fog. I turned around to face Preston. The rage I felt must have not been the fraction of rage Sarah was feeling, because I didn't get a step toward the boy before every firework at his feet exploded. He stumbled backward and cried out in surprise and pain. Then a dark spot began to grow at the crotch of his pants, and his eyes widened to a look of sheer terror. He stood up and began to run, screaming in horror and calling for help. A second later, Sarah rushed past me after the boy. I lunged forward, hoping to catch one of Sarah's hands, but she was too quick. The sun had set by now, and the park was growing dark quickly as I bolted after the children. Preston's legs and arms pumped wildly as he ran past trees and bushes, desperately trying to escape his pursuer. He turned and ran into the thicker part of the trees, with Sarah hot on his feet. I beelined toward them, calling Sarah's name and begging her to not do anything to Preston. I saw their shapes passing the trees. Preston, then Sarah. Preston, then Sarah, then it was just Sarah. "No!" I cried out desperately. "No, Sarah, no!" Sarah stopped, and I maneuvered around the trees as quickly as I could, praying that I would find anything other than a boy's body at her feet. I was both relieved and terrified when I found Sarah alone. Sarah, where's Preston?" I asked between hard breaths. "Where did he go?" "Nowhere," Sarah said. I looked around the ground, up the trees, in the bushes, and there was no sign of the boy. "Sarah," I said sharply, "what happened?" She didn't answer. I grabbed her shoulders, trying not to panic, but slowly losing the battle. "Sarah!" I yelled, shaking her. "Sarah, what did you do?" Hannah caught up to us by now and gently removed my hands from Sarah's shoulder. "What happened?" she asked. I could tell she was trying as hard as I was to keep her voice steady. "Where's Preston?" Sarah still said nothing. The glassy, dead look in her eyes remained unwavering. I looked down and saw the boy's footsteps in the dirt. In the quickly dwindling light, it was difficult to make them out from Sarah's and my own, but with the flashlight on my phone, I was able to track the boy's final steps. He'd run past a tree that I'd last seen him behind, then turn, and then his footsteps stopped in the middle of the path. They didn't lead to a tree or a bush, they just simply stopped. I searched for hours and found no other clue to Preston's whereabouts. Hannah took Sarah home and put her to bed. She still hadn't said a word about what happened, nor would she ever. When I'd exhausted my search of the tree, I had Hannah pick me up. We drove home in silence, neither of us sure what to say, but both feeling unspeakably terrified. I waited anxiously for the phone call from the police, for the news reports about the missing child, for the Amber Alert on my phone, but nothing came. There were no newspaper articles, no breaking news, no missing child posters, absolutely nothing. 2 weeks went by before I had the courage to ask Preston's father about him. We had never been on good terms, but he had been washing his car while I was out for my morning jog, and I didn't think another opportunity would present itself in the near future. "Hey, Mark," I called from the street. "Hey," he called back pleasantly, which somewhat surprised me. "How's it going?" "Not bad," I said. "I haven't seen Preston in a while. Is he at summer camp or something?" "Who?" Mark Jarvis asked. My heart had been pounding furiously in my chest from the anticipation of speaking with Preston's father, but now it seemed to stop completely. "What?" I asked breathlessly. "Who are you talking about?" Mark wore an expression of confusion, as if I'd just grown a second head. "Preston," I repeated. "Your son? About Sarah's age?" The corners of his mouth turned down slightly, and he raised his eyebrow. "I don't have a son," he said. "You feeling alright?" I tried to swallow, but my mouth was too dry. Yeah, I managed to get out. "Sorry, I think I might have just had a little stroke, I guess." "Ready to get inside then," he said, his expression now turning from confusion to genuine concern. "Sounds like it might be serious. You want me to walk you off the street with you?" "No thanks," I told him. I'll head back home now." He waved goodbye as I walked away, my morning cardio routine completely forgotten. Later that night, long after Sarah had fallen asleep, I would tell Hannah about what happened. She would look as confused as I felt for a moment. Then, after taking the time to fully process what had happened, she would begin to sob. We had thought that Sarah killed Preston Jarvis, but the reality was much worse. She had completely erased him from existence. It took weeks for the shock of what happened to Preston Jarvis to wear thin enough for Hannah and I to even think about what to do next. We both tried talking to Sarah about it, but the little girl we'd raised seemed to have evaporated that night along with Preston. Her eyes showed no joy, no love, no hope, nothing but emptiness. We attempted a few times to talk to Sarah about the incident, but it was obvious we couldn't get through to her. When we asked her exactly what happened to Preston, her answer was always different variations of, "I made him go away." She never said she killed him, and I suppose that wasn't entirely inaccurate, but she also said she couldn't bring him back. I'm not sure whether I believed that she couldn't undo what she'd done. At this point, I wasn't sure if she was capable of anything, or if it was more that she wouldn't undo what she'd done. I'm not sure which option terrified me more. Sarah kept to herself even more than she had in the past. Before, Hannah and I could always carry conversations with her and get her to join us on trips to the store, but now it was nearly impossible to even get her out of her bedroom for dinner. We would always go days without seeing her. We only knew she was alright because we could hear her moving around in her bedroom, and the plates of food Hannah would leave in the hallway would be emptied by morning. I tried to stay up late once to see if I could catch Sarah coming out of her bedroom, but I'd fallen asleep around 3 a.m., and by the time I woke up, the food was gone. Every night the scene replayed over and over in my mind. When I closed my eyes, I could see the trees silhouetted in the dark, feeling my heart racing, hearing the terrified final screams of the boy who would be wiped from existence in mere seconds. I hated that kid. It was hard to deny after the torment and pain he'd caused my family, but I wouldn't have wished his fate on anyone. I tried to tell myself that maybe things were better off this way. Maybe Preston would grow up to be a serial killer or something, but I knew in my heart that was probably not the case. Sarah had an effect on people that brought out the worst in them. Preston was a terrible kid, but would things have been different had his family not moved down the street from ours? Would he not have acted so maliciously if he hadn't been exposed to Sarah? There was no way to know for sure, but these questions are ones that kept me up at night. That was until the shock had worn off enough for me to finally consider the two questions that I'd been too afraid to broach. Was this the first time she'd done this? And would she do something like this again? I had a thought cross my mind in the wee hours of the morning after all, but the raccoons and crickets had gone to sleep. Originally, there had been 3 boys that tormented Sarah. The other 2 had allegedly moved away, but I hadn't seen a moving van. All we had to go by was a count of the bored and nosy neighbors on our street. I spent days thinking about this before I finally decided to find out for myself. If the Francis and Brian families really had moved, their houses would be empty. I waited until Hannah and Sarah were asleep. I had no intention of telling either of them anything until I had a solid conclusion. As much as I loved Hannah, she wasn't always good at keeping things from Sarah. She didn't have the same focus I did, I suppose. I didn't blame her for that, but it meant I had to go and be careful with what I told her. At around 3, I got out of bed and slipped on my shoes. The street was illuminated by the street lamps spaced a few houses apart, and the moon above cast an ominous glow around me as I stepped out into the July night. I put my hands in my pockets and began to stroll down the sidewalk. I badly wanted to run, to get there and be done with the whole business as quickly as possible, but I knew if someone did see me, a man running in the middle of the night seemed to be more suspicious than someone going on a late night stroll. It must have been only 10 or 15 minutes before I approached the house where Austin Francis had once lived. The yard was mostly dirt with only a few patches of grass here and there, all framed by a silver chain-like fence that once kept the bear and the Rottweiler from terrorizing the town. I opened the gate and approached the window. I didn't need to enter the house. I just needed to see inside, but unfortunately the freaking curtains were drawn. I walked to the perimeter of the house and attempted another window. Still, there was nothing to see but darkness. Sighing, I allowed myself one last attempt before I went to the Ryan household. I tried the knob on the back door. It twisted and the door opened with a soft creak that sent my heart pounding. I stepped in and was immediately hit by the acid scent of decaying meat. I turned on the lights and was unsurprised to find that there was no power. Using the flashlight on my phone, I toured the house. Bowls and plates still sat on the kitchen table. The food they had once held long since dried up, leaving gray and brown remnants. Curiously, I opened the fridge, then immediately closed it as a smell struck my face and made my eyes water. I walked the rest of the house, seeing dirty laundry, empty bottles of alcohol, and generally the signs of a house that was being lived in, not a house that had been vacated. The scent grew stronger and stronger as I approached the bedroom, terrified to see what was on the other side of the door, but knowing I had no other choice but if I intended to get answers. I turned the knob and stepped in. It was a boy's bedroom, presumably the bedroom of Austin Francis. Again, I found more indications that nobody had packed anything away. A television, a PlayStation, video games, model cars, things that no boy would leave without. But none of that was what surprised me. What surprised me were the black splatters of dried blood and tissue and fragments of bone that covered the walls, spreading like the bed, like the boy had gone to bed with a belly full of explosives. Now for the first time since entering the house, I swallowed back hot bile from the pit of my stomach. I closed the bedroom door, thinking then to wipe my fingerprints from the knob, then moved along to the master bedroom where I saw a familiar scene. Both Mr. and Mrs. Francis were lying in bed, except their heads had been removed from their bodies and replaced with similar arc of blood and gray matter painting the pillows, walls, and headboard. After that, I'd seen what I needed to and left the house in a haze. Once the door behind me was closed, I lost a battle with my stomach and lurched violently on the overgrown rose bushes that were planted a few feet away from the back door. How long ago had it been since the Francis family allegedly moved? I wasn't sure. It had definitely been over a year, probably closer to 2. I racked my brain as I made my way further down the street toward the Ryan house, trying to remember every detail I could about how the information had traveled to Hannah about the families had moved. She'd been the one to tell me on both accounts. She had said she got the information from Tammy Howell, the woman next door who had little better to do than talk on the phone and look out the window. why would Tammy lie about the Francis family moving? Or had she honestly thought that that was what happened? In similar fashion to how Preston's own father seemed to honestly think he'd never had a son. The Ryan house looked better kept from the outside, although not by much. Weeds had overgrown the lawn, and one of the windows had been broken, presumably by a rock thrown from the street. I again attempted to peer through the windows, but after a few fruitless endeavors, I let myself into the backyard to try my luck with the back door. Again, it opened without a problem. The stretch that hit my nose was far less potent than the one lingering in the Francis household, but equally as unnerving. Even still, I expected to find the similar signs of abandonment that I'd found in the other house, but when I flipped on my phone's light, I was surprised to see a somewhat clean, empty house. A layer of dust and dirt covered most of the surfaces, but there were no furniture, no pictures, nothing to indicate that the house was being lived in. It seemed that the house really had been vacated, except for the smell. I felt the smell to a bedroom and opened the door. Again, I had to choke back the urge to evacuate whatever was left in my stomach. My eyes watered as I lifted the light to illuminate the boys' bedroom. This time, instead of the whole room being painted in blood, only half of it was. Lying in the bed were the remains of Kenny Ryan. His left half was perfectly intact, his gray skin taut and dry against his skeleton, while his right was completely missing. It looked as if he had fallen sideways into a wood chipper. Unlike with the rest of the house, this room seemed completely untouched. There were no signs of any intention of packing up Kenny's possessions for the oncoming move. In fact, it seemed as if the family had simply forgotten him. It was with this thought that my heart dropped even further. They really had forgotten about Kenny. He hadn't disappeared like Preston, but he may as well have been in the hearts and minds of his family. Is that what Sarah had been trying to do to the Ryan family the year before? There was no way to know for sure. I had no intention of asking her, but that seemed to fit a morbid sort of way. After spending another few weeks fully processing what I'd found, I'd shared my discovery with Hannah, and I was a bit nervous to pull her deeper into the problem. She had always struggled with keeping things from Sarah, but I felt like the secret would devour me if I kept it any freaking longer. The start of the school year was fast approaching, and Hannah and I were obsessing over the decision whether or not to allow Sarah to enroll for another year. We were terrified that something else would happen, especially given what I'd found about the Ryan and Francis families, but we also wanted to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Sarah. And if I'm being honest, Hannah and I needed a break from the constant buzz of danger and unease that followed our daughter and had now coated every surface of our house. We hadn't yet made our decision, but decided it was best for Sarah to go to an orientation at least. We decided I would go with her to see how she did, if anyone came up to her to ask how her summer went, or was, or to find out if there were others like Preston Jarvis on Sarah's chopping block. Nobody approached her, but there was also no bullying either. All things considered, I took it as a win. When we arrived home, Hannah was gone. She'd left a note telling us she'd gotten a call from the neighbor who needed help with something and would be back late. This struck me as odd, but I did my best not to think about it, just in case Sarah was listening in from her bedroom, which she'd made a beeline to the moment that we arrived home. Later that night, I received a text from Hannah asking if Sarah was asleep. I told her that she was, and Hannah walked in the front door, face red and eyes swollen. She started, then began sobbing. I held her and let her tears soak into my shirt until eventually she calmed down enough to speak. "I'm so scared," she finally whispered. "Scared of what?" I asked, knowing damn well what she was afraid of. I was afraid of it too. "I found something," Hannah said, pulling away from me. She swallowed, and I could see her throat bob up and down as she searched for the words. "When you and Sarah left for orientation, I went through her bedroom. I didn't want to say anything about it because I hated when my parents would go through my bedroom, and I hope they they wouldn't find anything. She paused for a moment. But, I said, feeling the silence and searching her eyes for the answer. What did you find? She shook her head, unable to speak, then pulled out her phone and handed it to me. On the screen was a picture she'd taken of an old stained shoebox. Inside was a collection of tails from a variety of small animals. Some of them were very old and brittle, others fairly fresh with meat still clinging on from where they tore off. This pile of tails sat in a nest, composed of dozens of blood-stained collars and pet tags. I looked up in shock and disbelief. I found that in her closet, Hannah said. Go to the next picture. I swiped to the left and saw the image of an open book. It took me a moment, but I recognized it as a journal Sarah had received from one of her grandmothers last Christmas. I can't say for certain when the idea of killing Sarah first crossed my mind. It could have been that night Hannah showed me pictures of Sarah's journal. It could have been that night Preston Jarvis disappeared. It could have been during the hellish weeks that followed while we walked on eggshells around our own house, praying to any god that will listen to deliver us the nightmare we had found ourselves in. For a while, nothing seemed real. Could Sarah, my Sarah, kill people? No way, never. But she had. Pictures of her from school, smiling happily back at us from in front of a painted woodland background hugged the hallway. I would pass them, seeing her bright eyes, and ask myself if I truly believed that little girl was capable of the atrocities we accused her of. It was simply not possible, but it was. The idea sat in the back of my head, festering like an infected boil for weeks until it suddenly burst, spreading its contents all over my mind. I hated myself for thinking it, for even allowing the thoughts to come into my mind so clearly as that, but I hated myself even more for failing to see another option. There was no psychologist, no corrections officer, no court that could contain her. If Sarah wanted to be free to do what she wished, then it was just a matter of willing it so. Perhaps if there was a correct dosage of some drug we can give her so that it could dampen these abilities, and maybe there was a chance to reason with her. But if we got it wrong, it would cost the lives of everyone involved and countless others. The only way to ensure everyone's safety was to remove Sarah from the board altogether. She was too powerful, too psychotic to be able to live a happy, healthy life. She had always been a scourge in the neighborhood, no matter how much love we had shown her. And for 13 years, it had been proven time and time again that the rest of the world would shut her out, and fear and hate her. Perhaps that fate would be the best for her as well. I knew that wasn't true, but that was a lie I told myself to get myself to sleep. When I brought this idea up to Hannah, I think a part of me wanted her to hate me for it. I wanted her to slap me across the face and tell me how awful I was for even suggesting such a thing, but she would give me no such satisfaction. I had taken her to dinner under the guise of wanting a romantic evening under the house. After we'd ordered our entries, however, Hannah called me out. "What is it?" she asked, a note of concern and dread in her voice. I frowned. Don't give me that look," she said, a bit more harshly than I think she intended. "You got us out of the house so we could talk about Sarah, didn't you? Has something else happened?" No, I said, shaking my head. "Nothing like that." She took a sip of her water. "But it is something about Sarah, isn't it?" I collected myself for a minute, drinking about half my glass of ice water as I did so, then told Hannah my idea. My heart felt like it was going to beat right out of my chest onto the plate of Alfredo I'd ordered. Hannah didn't speak for several long moments. I tried to eat my meal, but at that moment it seemed like the least appetizing thing in the world. When she did speak, her voice was low, quiet, and bubbling over with regret. "I think you're right." I wasn't sure if I was going to laugh or sob. The two balanced each other out, and instead I sat there stoically. "Did you hear me?" Hannah asked. Tears were welling in her eyes, and then in the corners of her mouth, where it was twitching downward. I nodded, still unable to speak. My throat was burning. We sat for hours in that restaurant, eventually found our stomachs after some time, and we were able to put at least a little food down. It was there that we began to hatch our plan. The first part of the plan was to get our neighbors on board. at least Bob from across the street and Tammy next door. They were the most likely of anyone to see or notice anything suspicious. We told ourselves that either Bob or Tammy refused to help us, or at least corroborate the story we would craft, and then we would call the whole thing off. I rehearsed what I would say a dozen times before I found myself on Bob's front porch with a plate of cookies Hannah had made. Bob smiled when he opened the door and saw the cookies, but when he met my eyes, his smile collapsed. "Come on in," Bob said. "You look like you've got something to talk about." He led me in and around the corner where he had 2 maroon recliners. The house smelled of roses. "Can I get you a drink?" Bob asked, but already he was shuffling to the kitchen. "Sure," I answered, knowing well that if I hadn't declined his offer, Bob would still come out with 2 beers anyway. I heard the tinkling of glass and the familiar sound of the cap being removed. Then Bob came back around the corner. He handed me a bottle, then sat down in the adjacent recliner, sighing. "Now, what's on your mind, son?" I tried to swallow, but my mouth was too dry. Took a sip of the beer and began. "Sarah's not well," I said. Bob raised his eyebrows. "Is it the cancer?" No, nothing like that," I said. "She got something wrong with her mind. I'm sure you've noticed that she's different from the other children and that she makes people feel, well, uncomfortable." Bob nodded. I swallowed another sip of beer. "We've done what we can to help her, but things have gotten past a point where we can offer help, where anyone can offer help." I paused, searching Bob's face. What I was about to say next would condemn me. "Do you remember that day Bear got hit by that U-Haul? That was Sarah. She's able to do things like that, but also much more terrible things. I think that's why people feel the way they do when they're around her. They can sense that she's different. She's dangerous. A few things have happened. I'd rather not get into details, but I will if you need me to, that I've brought Hannah and myself to the conclusion that..." Bob held up a hand. My stomach twisted around like a coiled snake. "Did I ever tell you my time in the service?" I shook my head, so taken aback by this sudden change in topic that I momentarily lost my voice. "I was stationed near Kiastan in '68 and saw more bloodshed than any man could ever see in his life. Thousands of people died that year. Many nights I would fall asleep to the sounds of gunfire in the distance and wake up to the sounds of men screaming. I can't say I didn't take lives. God help me, I took far more than I care to say, but there were others." He trailed off, and for a moment I wondered if he would continue his story. When he spoke again, his voice was rough and his eyes misted by tears from the past. "I first met Paul when we were in boot camp together, and he was my only lasting friend throughout the entire nightmare. When the killing started, I didn't think I could be more terrified, but when I looked at Paul, I saw something that scared me even more than the thought of losing my life to the enemy. I could see the pleasure in Paul's eyes every time he fired his weapon at another man. He enjoyed it. He loved it. He told stories of his exploits, his murders, as if they were some hunting tales. He'd talk about many guerrillas he'd killed, and like they were nothing but a few low-point bucks. And with every word he spoke, his self-satisfaction grew. As the days became weeks, and the weeks became months, that look in his eyes stayed. The story he told became more horrendous, and the man that he once seemed to be lost forever. I saw him open fire on men, women, and children, relishing every final breath he took for his own. I saw him commit atrocities that I would never speak of. We got our transfer papers one night, and where most men would feel joy and excitement to finally leave the bloodshed, I felt horror. Horror for those that would cross paths with my once dear friend, for I had no doubt in my mind that the killing may have stopped for me, but for Paul, it was only just begun. It was a game to him now. He would continue to play. The last life I ever took was that of my best friend in the jungle of Vietnam on the day before we were set to transfer. We had stumbled across a family of travelers along the road, where I saw people, men, women, children, Paul saw nothing but lambs for the slaughter. He brought up his rifle to his shoulder. I shot him in the back of the head. I don't wonder if I did the right thing, but if I had done the right thing sooner, how many innocent lives would have been saved? Bob held the bottle up to his lips and finished his beer, and stood up and went to the kitchen for another. "I love that little girl of yours," he called from the kitchen. The note of pain that had developed in his voice now seemed to seep through the walls. "I too want what's best for her. I won't hear the question you came here to ask. Such things are better left unsaid, but I think you'll find the answer, nonetheless." Hannah and I have both been avoiding watching the news in the house since Sarah arrived home. There was something like the news of the red trailer truck stop would come on and our thoughts would betray us. All it took was one glimpse of that truck stop, and I knew we wouldn't be able to help immediately thinking about that night. It was like having a gun to my head and watching a documentary about lions and trying not to think about a lion, even for a moment, lest the trigger be pulled. The truth is that we had passed that truck stop 2 times that night, once with a little girl buckled up in the back seat, her lifeless head lolling around as the car hit bumps on the road, and once with nothing but silence and a queer sense of relief filling the car. It was the closest sign of civilization from where we had left Sarah, and would have been the first place anyone would stop if they had a teenager hitchhiker in the passenger seat with no memory of how she got there. The morning of the day Sarah showed up on our doorstep was when a short order cook had discovered a truck stop full of bodies. That was no coincidence. Sarah had been there, but what had caused her to kill those people? Had she been attacked? It's possible, but I don't think so. There were no signs of violence at all, at least according to the news, and I would imagine if someone had attacked her, there would either be no body at all or their body would be smeared across the walls. I think that it boils down to 2 scenarios. Either Sarah had no control over what happened, or she had complete control and simply didn't care, like a child stomping on an anthill. Regardless of which way that door swings, it leads to a room with a nuclear missile, and I've been sleeping right next door. I'd been debating with myself for a while about whether to bring the news of the red trailer truck stop up with Hannah. The secret feels as if it would consume me, but I fear it would be too much for Hannah to take. She was never as good at keeping things from Sarah as I was, and she's already been trying to keep an enormous one from breaking down the barriers in her mind. But if something is to be done about Sarah being around and equally as dangerous as before, then I'm not sure if I'm capable of carrying that burden alone. The answer, as it so happens, came to me this morning in the form of a newspaper. We don't subscribe to the newspaper, so when Hannah slid it across the breakfast table, I was a bit perplexed. You should give them a look at work later and we can make a shopping list. Sarah was still in bed, but even still, it was wise to continue to keep up the charade. "You got it," I said, finishing my coffee in 2 gulps and grabbing my bag. "I'm gonna head out now." I kissed Hannah and left the house quickly, knowing that the longer I stayed there, the more likely my curiosity would seep through the thin veneer of my thoughts about work and what to do for lunch later. I drove down the street and parked in a gas station a few blocks away. I had half an hour before I needed to be at work, so there was plenty of time to read whatever Hannah was trying to get me out to read. I was about to look for the coupon section, thinking she'd given me a clue, but as it turns out, what I needed to read was on the front page. Many have long suspected a connection between the recent series of unexplained deaths, starting with those individuals at the red trailer truck stop, and most recently occurring yesterday in the case of Robert Sullivan. But it wasn't until yesterday evening that representatives from the Federal Bureau of Investigation officially announced that they are researching possible connections between these deaths. Including the 8 victims of the red trailer truck stop, there have been over 20 deaths that have baffled both police and medical examiners. If there had been any identified cause of death, FBI Representative Todd Hull states, we would have entered the possibility of a mentally ill individual or a group of ill individuals harming the public. Right now, We are researching the possible and likely connection between these deaths and urge the public to contact the local medical professionals immediately with any unexplained changes in mood, activity level, awareness level, diet, and so forth. This does not appear to be related to the drinking water, nor an airborne contaminant, but I assure you we are exploring very possible avenue. Hall further urges the public to be vigilant and to pay close attention to loved ones. Probably the most baffling part of this whole case is the lack of public engagement, Hall says. Not a single victim has been reported to the police by close friends or family for several days. I cannot stress enough that vigilance is key to assuring the safety of ourselves and our loved ones. Hall, of course, is referring to the fact that each death has been reported only by neighbors or passby. Authorities have reported family and close friends acting shocked by the news of the death of their loved ones, even though those loved ones may have been in plain sight for several days prior to a wellness check by police. As I read this article, it felt as if my head was floating underwater. Sarah hadn't stopped at the truck stop, and now it seemed as if her reach was even further than it was 3 years ago. Robert Sullivan, Bob as I knew him, lived 10 miles away on the other side of town. There, sitting in the gas station parking lot with the newspaper sitting across my lap and steering wheel, I began to cry. The night we killed our daughter is one that will forever be branded in my mind. Each night afterward, as I closed my eyes and drifted off to sleep, I would replay those moments and events over and over, relieving the darkest, most shameful moment of my life. I would remember the weight of Sarah's lifeless body in my arms, the weight of my own heart as I carried her from the car, and I would silently weep. Hannah and I needed months of careful planning before we could make our move. Which proved especially difficult because we couldn't even think about what we were going to do lest Sarah discover our secrets. Every morning as I drove to work, I would finally get the chance to think about how I would take my daughter's life. Every evening as I drove home, I would work to push those thoughts from my brain and replace them with thoughts of how work went and whatever songs were on the radio. It was during one of these morning commutes, singing about a cowboy's sad, sad song, that I just couldn't get out of my head when it finally hit me. One of the most surefire ways Hannah had been able to keep Sarah out of her mind was by keeping a song stuck in her head. I'd assumed that had been why she started singing more, but I hadn't noticed until that moment that all 3 songs were by an 80s band called Poison, a group I knew Hannah didn't listen to. That night when I got home, I put my theory to the test by singing Louis Duran's song my mother used to play. We understood each other. Hannah didn't know the song, but the moment I got to the chorus, her eyes snapped so quickly I thought she had certainly given herself away. I quickly glanced at Sarah, careful to keep my mind on the song. She was sitting quietly on the couch, staring through the window into the night sky. She did that more and more often those days, like she was somewhere else entirely. She would spend hours in such a position, staring at nothing but the blank space between her face and the window. I'd often wonder how cognizant she really was of her surroundings, but didn't dare allow myself to think she was anything less than completely aware. It was through that method that Hannah and I hatched our plan. It was early spring. The days had finally begun to get longer, but that day felt like the longest of all. I went to work, Sarah to school, and Hannah spent the day running errands. Hannah and I met for lunch at a diner around the corner from my office. I ordered the tomato soup and BLT, and Hannah had the tuna melt. We talked about the grocery list and Sarah's upcoming math test, putting on a show for anyone that might remember us later. Although there were very few people in the diner that afternoon, and fewer still that might be within earshot. That was partially why I had chosen that diner. The other part was because I knew the security camera in the corner wasn't working, so there would be no record of Hannah carefully sliding a small envelope across the table, concealed by her palm. The envelope contained a white powder I understood to be midazolam, a potent sedative. As it turned out, the neighbor Hannah had gone to see while I spoke with Bob. Tammy Howell had a nurse friend with low morals who had been able to procure a pill here and there for Tammy when she asked. It had only taken a phone call and a couple of weeks before the drug was in our possession. I'd been hoping for something strong, but it was assured that this should do the trick, especially since this powder had once been in the form of 10 whole pills prior to Hannah crushing them up, far more than would ever be used for a single dose. With that kind of dosage, I'd imagine any sedative would do the job. A few hours later, I was parked in the garage. Next to me sat 2 greasy paper bags and a cardboard carrier with 3 milkshakes. Under normal circumstances, one of the bags would have been opened and half of the fries gone, but that night they stayed untouched. What little I had eaten during lunch had all come up a few hours later, and the thought of eating anything else sickened me. Inside the bags were 3 burgers, each wrapped in foil and held together by a label to identify contents. I had the bacon jalapeno burger, Hannah had the chicken sandwich, and Sarah had her favorite bacon cheeseburger with extra pickles. The sticker had made things a bit more difficult than I hoped, but with patience I had been successful in peeling it back enough to slide the sandwich free and sprinkle about half of the envelope's contents in the middle. The rest had gone into her chocolate shake. Of course I couldn't think about these things though as I sat in the garage, just about how rough work had been and wondering if I was coming down from something, or if I just had acid reflux, which would give me an excuse later if I couldn't keep dinner down. I put on a smile and carried the food in as I walked through the door. Hannah met me at the door and kissed my cheek and thanked me for picking up dinner. Hannah set up the table and began dividing up the contents of the bag while I approached Sarah's bedroom. I rapped on the door 3 times, as always. "Hey, Ann, dinner's here," I said. Nothing but silence answered me. I had been expecting this. Sarah seldom joined us for meals anymore. For weeks, we only really saw her just before and after school as she made a beeline toward her bedroom and the front door. Every other moment was spent locked in a room, presumably reading. I hadn't allowed myself to think for a moment Sarah was doing anything else for fear I might be right. What I hadn't been expecting was the sound of the door opening behind me after I turned and started backward toward the kitchen. Resigned to leave her food in front of her bedroom door like always. Silhouetted in the darkness, Sarah's bedroom light was never on, so did my daughter. She looked thin, pale, and her hair hung in thick, greasy ropes. She looked like nothing but an empty husk now, and for a brief moment I felt better about what would soon transpire. This thing in Sarah's body wasn't my daughter. She was a wolf in sheep's clothing. "Hey, kiddo," I said. "Glad you decided to join us. I got your favorite, complete with a chocolate shake. 'Cause I don't know about you, but I've had one hell of a week." Sarah didn't respond with more than an empty stare. We ate in the most poignant silence of my life. Sarah didn't look up at either of us, just ate the food in front of her, while her head was hovering closely to the plate. I wasn't sure when the last time I saw her eat was, but watching it now gave me chills. God, she ate like an animal. Her head snapped at me as that thought slipped through the cracks of my mind. Grease and salt and condiments were smeared across her face and hands. Hatred shot from her eyes like bullets. "Do you want a napkin?" I asked, attempting to sound casual, but knowing I had failed even as the words came out. I was staring into the face of a hideous beast. The longer she stared at me, the less human she seemed. Her pupils had completely overtaken the irises, leaving nothing but black pools of tar amidst a sea of white. Her jaw jutted forward in a bit of an unnatural way, and it wasn't until she smiled at me that I understood why. Her teeth were flat and shallow from the months of being constantly ground together. The teeth alone were enough to send chills down my spine, but the way her mouth worked as she smiled, the muscles in her cheeks and jaw tightening, the veins in her neck and forehead pushing against her skin like worms below the surface, that was enough to make me want to run. I passed her a napkin, tapped the corner of my mouth to show her where she needed to wipe the ketchup from, and returned to finish my meal. The moment her food was gone, Sarah returned to her bedroom. Hannah and I exchanged the quickest of looks, then began to clean up. I had read that midazolam takes somewhere around half an hour to take effect, but we elected to give it an hour. As the hour passed, the strangest feeling of calm began to slowly trickle into the house. It was so foreign to me that I'd wondered for a moment if I'd eaten the wrong burger, and was now feeling the sedative take effect, but knew in an instant that wasn't possible. The calm we were feeling wasn't calm at all, not really, but the sense of danger being lifted from the house. We'd spent so many years under this dark blanket of doom and depression and fear that I'd forgotten what it felt like to feel safe in my own home. It would seem that the drug had done its job. At the very minute the hour passed, Hannah and I were knocking on Sarah's door. "Sarah?" I called. No answer. Not that there would have been one anyway, but this time there was no shuffling sound, no footsteps, nothing at all. I clenched my jaw, my Hannah's hopeful and horrified gaze, then opened the door. Our daughter sat on the floor, leaning limply against the wall. I thought about turning on the light, but thought better of it. It was best I saw as little as possible. In her lap sat the open shoebox Hannah had discovered, and between her lifeless fingers was the orange tail of a cat. It looked fresh. I knelt down and called her name again. "Sarah. Sarah, can you hear me? It's your dad." Nothing. I felt her neck for a pulse. Nothing. I laid her down and put my head over her mouth and nose, looking for the sound or feel of breath. Nothing. Finally, Hannah had retrieved the stethoscope Tammy had lent her, and I used it to listen for a heartbeat. We needed to be sure. I stood up and sighed, and with that sigh came over a decade's worth of tears. Tears for the pets Sarah had taken, tears for the families Sarah had ruined, but mostly tears for the little girl who had once brought me my oil filter wrench when she heard me in my mind that I needed it. The little girl who had so much potential, but had been born into a world that would shun her and fear her and hate her for what she could do. None of this had been her fault, but she'd had to bear it nonetheless. It wasn't fair. It had never been fair. I sobbed for a long time, holding my daughter's body in an embrace I hadn't dared while her heart still beat. Hannah sat next to me, sobbing into the nape of my neck. We cried until the wells ran dry, and there were no more tears left to express the depression, fear, regret, and relief we felt. The wells would fill again, though, and the tears would be back, but it was best that they had left for at least the next few hours. We still had work to do. Hannah carried Sarah to the car. She was disturbingly light, and I went to work on the window frame with the crowbar from the shed. Once I'd gotten the window pried open, I'd cleaned the wood and paint from the end of the crowbar and returned it to the shed. Behind me, Bob's grave face watched from the window. He met my eye as I went back to examine my handiwork, and I gave him the slightest nod of confirmation. He wiped the palm across his face, presumably to catch the falling tear, then closed the curtain. Hannah was already waiting in the car. Behind her, buckled in with a blanket draped across her lap, sat Sarah's lifeless body. This had been something we'd thought about at length, and had been the topic of conversation several times, and we'd found ourselves able to actually speak plainly without fear of Sarah overhearing. We had no idea how the medication would affect Sarah, nor did we know if killing her was even possible, so Hannah had the idea of buckling Sarah in the back seat. If she suddenly woke up, we would have a better story to tell her than if she awoke in a locked trunk. We drove in silence for 2 hours, passing the red trailer truck stop along the way before we reached the point where roads became trails, then another hour as we forged our own trail through the desert. We drove until we finally found what we had been looking for, a distant mine shaft that hadn't been nearly used in half a century after a cave-in took the lives of a dozen men. This wasn't the main shaft that usually saw its fair share of graffiti artists and ghost hunters, but one on the other side of the former compound that wasn't seldom used because of how small it was. It was only large enough to shuttle equipment from the mine to the surface, but if a person was small enough, they could slide themselves down and never see daylight again. We hiked the distance from the car to the mine shaft, taking turns carrying Sarah on our arms and passing her back and forth as we climbed the few chain-link fences marked with no trespassing signs. When we arrived, I took a final moment to say goodbye to Sarah and to tell her how sorry I was for everything that had happened to her. Hannah had already begun crying again, but was able to choke out a heartfelt "Goodbye, baby girl. I'll always love you." I kissed Sarah on the forehead. Hannah did the same, and with that, we bid farewell to our little girl forever. So we thought. The news of Bob's death weighed heavy on my mind since I first learned of it. Equally as heavy was the news of Tammy Howell that I learned of a few days later. I recognized several of the other names on the news, including Mark Jarvis, Preston's father, Lawrence Marshall, Sarah's former math teacher, and Evelyn Gates, the mother of a girl who had suffered 2 broken legs after she stuck a gum in Sarah's hair during lunch. If there was any doubt that Sarah was involved in these deaths, it was dashed that night. Hannah and I had just sat down to dinner when there was a knock at the door. I stood from where I sat at the table wondering who it could be, while Hannah sat quietly in the kitchen. Sarah was in her room where she'd been for most of the afternoon, a plate of food just outside her bedroom door. I opened the front door and saw the nervous face of David Preston, my neighbor from across the street. He was a slight man, not elderly but approaching his twilight years, who had made a living for the past 2 decades as a business accountant. Complete with thick, rimmed glasses and a pen in his breast pocket, Dave couldn't look the part better if he tried. "Hey Dave," I said, a bit bemused. "Everything alright?" "I actually came over here to ask you that," he answered. There was a tremble in his voice I'd never heard before. "Sure, what's going on?" He swallowed, searching for the right words. "Well, I've been meaning to come over and make sure you and Hannah were doing alright." He held up a plate of brownies I had noticed until just then. "I had to make these for you. Thought it might help with whatever you're going through." I frowned. I'm sorry, Dave. I'm not sure I know what you're talking about." He held up a hand apologetically. "I'm sorry. I don't mean to pry. We've just seen you and Hannah a bit less than usual, and when we do see you, we can tell that there's something troubling you. We've tried to wave a few times, but I think you've been so wound up in your own world to notice, which is just fine," he added quickly. "We don't take any offense. We just wanted to let you know that we're here for you both if you ever need an IREs." I was touched, nearly to the point of tears. "Thank you, Dave," I told him. "That's very kind." I took the plate and was just about to shut the door when he stopped me. "There's something else I wanted to talk to you about," he said in a low, conspiring voice. Behind me, I heard the faintest creak of a door opening down the hallway. I matched Dave's low tone. "What is it?" "This is going to sound a bit crazy, so please know that I wouldn't say this if I hadn't seen it for myself, but sometimes Nancy and I think we can see a woman standing in your upstairs window." I could feel the moisture leave my throat. "I'm sorry? I don't think it's Hannah. This woman is rail thin, very unhealthy. You don't have anyone else living here, do you?" I shook my head. "No." "I was afraid of that," Dave said. He looked around, feeling the same sense of growing danger that I felt. "Now, here's the crazy part. And please know this comes from a place of love for you and your wife, but I don't think that woman we've seen in your window is human. She doesn't seem right." And it was then that Dave's neck snapped, tilting in an unnatural jagged angle, and the plate of brownies fell to the pavement and shattered. I heard nothing at first, just a fast beating of my heart and the high-pitched hum of blood in my ears. Then, all at once I heard the screaming. It came into stereo, from both behind me and across the street. Nancy Preston had watched the scene from her doorstep, and Hannah, it seemed, from behind me. I slammed the door shut and whirled around. Hannah had indeed been standing behind me, and behind her, wearing the same Chesterton grin I'd seen the second night she'd stayed with us, stood Sarah. Her hair fell on her face in twisted knots, and although her mouth was shaped in a crescent moon of lucent joy, her eyes were like that of a corpse. "You shouldn't have thought those things," Sarah said tonelessly. "They always think those things." Hannah continued screaming, her arms and hands shaking. She looked at Sarah, then at me, and that look told me far more than it should have. It told me that she was helplessly remembering that night and every night leading up to it, which would be her demise. The screaming stopped abruptly, or at least the sound had. Hannah's throat still flexed and her veins still stood out in her neck, but no sound escaped her throat. "Sarah," I began, but I suddenly lost my own voice as well, and all I could choke out was a dry wheeze. "She was never as good as the game as you were, was she?" Sarah asked me in the same toneless voice. She would sing songs, trying to keep me out, but eventually her thoughts would trickle through in her dreams. "What are you talking about?" I thought to Sarah, still unable to speak, but knowing she could hear me. "Don't pretend, Daddy. She told you everything. She poisoned my food that night, dumped me in the desert, and left me to rot, and told everyone that I'd simply gone missing. Everyone but you, that is. You helped her do it. You helped her carry me to the desert and leave me there to rot." Hannah closed her eyes, and for a moment, her hold on Hannah's throat waned, and my wife was allowed a final, ear-splitting cry. Just like Preston Jarvis, Hannah, my wife, and Sarah's mother had been erased from existence. I fell to my knees and began to sob. Sarah approached me slowly, then knelt down and pressed her lips to my ear. Her breath was hot and putrid, a scent of rotting meat that I would later find in the form of a half-eaten bird in her bedroom. I won't take her away for you like I did Preston's parents. You don't deserve that," I said. "I'll leave her in your mind, but only just enough to you forgotten." I looked up and met her eyes for the last time, seeing nothing but two black, hateful pupils, and then Sarah was gone as well, and I was alone. I didn't allow myself to think about it then, and wouldn't allow myself until long after the feeling of dread had been lifted from the house, but when it had, I felt a wave of regret and love crash into me like a freight train. My wife hadn't been able to keep Sarah out, and she'd known it. She couldn't keep Sarah from finding out the truth, but she could keep her from finding out the whole truth. She'd twisted things around enough to give me a chance for mercy, to allow Sarah to believe that Hannah had been the instigator and I only had been involved after it was too late. Which I know I didn't deserve. The police did come eventually to collect Dave's body from my porch. A passing jogger had seen his corpse lying on my porch and had called 911. Even though his wife had seen what happened, had screamed his name as he fell to the ground, she told the police the last thing she remembered was having her husband take brownies over to the neighbors, and that she'd been unaware of the fact that he lay dead in plain view right across the street. I'm inclined to believe her story because I've seen what Sarah can do, and perhaps that's Sarah's way of granting mercy. With every breath I take, I can feel a little more of my wife's memory slip away. I know it's still there somewhere deep in my mind, but trying to recall things about her is becoming harder and harder, like trying to recall a dream after waking up. The features of her face are becoming distorted, blurry, and the memories we shared, our first kiss, our first date, our wedding night, are being blanketed by a haze I know I will never be lifted. Sarah isn't gone, not like the others. I can still feel her presence, however distant, and I know it's only a matter of time until she returns home again. So if you find yourself suddenly unable to recall the face of a loved one, or if you feel a prickling sensation on the nape of your neck while you sit alone in your bedroom, if you find yourself awake in the middle of the night with a sense of dread hanging over you, know that it may be Sarah, and keep your thoughts guarded.
I'm an avid hiker and happen to live near a national park that I think it's best for not to name. Me and my friends go hiking there often, or I guess did. If you have ever been to a national park, you might have noticed certain areas were restricted for one reason or another. This one was no different, and the reason we were given was that the terrain was too dangerous. To me and my friends, this only made it sound more fun. When you spend as much time in a park as you begin to catch on to the rangers' routines. Soon you are able to avoid them with ease. And so, we made our way to the restricted area. We were soon met with disappointment as the terrain was quite flat and boring. It would have been safer there than other parts of the park. My friends and I started speculating why they might want to keep people out of here. And then we started to get shot at. We started running. I made the mistake of looking back. I didn't see the shooter, and I didn't see the hole in front of me either. After falling a good 10 feet, I began examining my legs to see if I had broken them. My eye caught something. Beneath some rocks was an old and deteriorating satchel. Contained within it was some shotgun shells and what appeared to be a journal. Soon, my friends came back and helped me out of the hole. We all escaped without taking any bullets. One of my friends proposed the idea that they were simply trying to scare us away and may have only used blanks. But that didn't make any sense. What could they be trying to hide, and why would they keep it in such a public area? Now, I think I know the answer. Once home, I began looking through the journal and found that many of the pages, although frail, were still intake. The name, Ellie Johnson, is written on the front. The remaining pages reads as follows. October 6, 1915. The trees are all beautiful this time of year. It's a shame the leaves don't last long. I'd rather they look this way all year. I used some of the leaves to make beds for the sheep. I thought they could use them as it's getting colder. Dad says it would be colder this year because our new land is higher up than the old. At first, that didn't make much sense to me, but now I can feel he's right. October 8th, 1915. I've noticed my chores get done a fair bit faster now that there ain't much more than a cow and some sheep to feed. But this has left me with nothing much to do. My friends are all miles away now, and there ain't anybody out here but us. I try to help Mom when I can, especially since she's carrying my little sister or brother, but most of the time she insists on doing things herself. I never thought I'd want more chores. October 9th, 1915. Nothing much happened today other than a sheep escaped for about half a minute before Dad caught her. Ain't really sure why I opened this book. October 12th, 1915. Dad's bringing a friend of his up here to go hunting. His name's Stan. Can't say I know him too well, I only met him once at a church. I asked Dad if I could come with them. He said someone had to stay back and help Mom. He was right, I suppose, but that'll make me happy about it. October 13th, 1915. I woke up this morning and found it snowed in the night. It's got to be at least 3 inches. I went to see what Dad might have brought home, but he hasn't gotten back yet. Mom's real worried, and so am I. Dad's usually gone a few hours, never all night. He's never gone hunting in those woods before neither. I told Mom I should go out and see if I could find them. She didn't care much for the idea at all. Says they'll get lost too. Says we should just wait. So, I suppose that's what we're gonna do. October 14th, 1915. Dad's still gone. I told Mom that someone was going to have to go looking for them, and since she's pregnant, it would have to be me. She began to cry, saying she's not going to lose her entire family. Then she said if he wasn't back tomorrow, she'd send me into town to get help. I didn't want her any more upset than she already is, so I agreed. But I know he ain't gonna be back tomorrow, and if he's hurt, he's gonna need help real quick. So when Mom went to bed, I grabbed the shotgun by the door and some shells. I took the lantern too. If I can find Dad and Stan, I'll help them back home and Mom will be happy. And if I don't, I'll come home and she'll never know. October 16th, 1915. I think I'm lost. I found the footprints leading into the forest, thinking I'll find them in no time. But that damned snow kept falling and the footprints began to fade, till I can't see them anymore. At least not with my little lantern, but I wasn't gonna let this stop me. I kept walking where I figured they must have gone. This foolish idea went as well as one might expect. That lantern ain't worth dirt. I didn't know I was on a hill till I was rolling down it. I hit my head against a rock on the way down. Everything went black. I woke up the next morning half buried in snow, but by the good grace of Lord, I didn't break any bones. I climbed back up the hill to find that the snow had already erased my tracks, just the same as the others. I thought if I just kept walking straight, I'd end up back home, but after an hour, I was still in the woods. I kept on wandering in every direction without finding nothing but more trees and snow, like the damn thing goes on forever. Didn't see a single animal either, not one squirrel nor bird. Like these woods are dead. I did find a small cave. I reckoned it'd be better than sleeping under a tree, but I didn't get any sleep. Something strange started howling as soon as my eyes closed. It didn't sound like any wolf I had known of. I ain't really sure how to describe it, but it was close by, much closer than I would have liked. I thought I might have been trying to sleep in its home, so I kept the gun ready. I didn't stop until the sun began to peek through the trees. Only then I could rest. I woke about midday. I wonder if Mom is alright. Probably not too happy. I hope she don't come looking for me like a fool, like me. I hope she goes and get help. October 17th, 1915. I think it's the next day, but I ain't sure. I ain't sure of anything. I begin another day of hopelessly trying to escape the woods. I don't think they ever end. I think home might be 1,000 miles away, if even that close. I came across some footprints. They were bigger than a bear and had some inch-long claws. Next to them seemed to be the marks of something being dragged along. I followed them. I know it wasn't smart, but it was something. Something in a forest of nothing. As I followed, I'd find blood around the tracks every now and again. I kept walking until I came across a cave. This one was much larger than the one I used for shelter. There was something inside. It was a giant beast hunched over eating something. There was blood all around the mouth of the cave. I saw the bones of the creature's back poking through its gray skin. I stood frozen and started to cry. I wasn't sure why at the time, but now I believe it was because I knew who it was eating. Before I could make too much noise, a hand went over my mouth, and I was dragged behind a nearby rock. It was Stan. He gestured for me to be quiet and asked for the shotgun. I gave it to him. I asked him what happened to his gun. He told me he dropped it while running away from that beast. Then I asked where Dad was. He didn't answer. I tried keeping my tears quiet, but I failed. In the blink of an eye, that antlered monster had its jaws in my leg. I screamed in pain before Stan shot it in the face. He released me and turned towards him. He shot it in the chest. This didn't seem to do much other than making it mad. The gun was now empty, but the monster was still enraged. Stan ran off into the never-ending forest with the abomination gaining behind him, leaving me alone. It was going to catch him and kill him and drag him back here, and then it was going to do the same to me. I got up and began limping away. I kept my eyes closed until I was past the cave. I didn't want to see what was inside. I didn't get far before falling through the earth. Now I'm stuck in a hole. I don't think it's a work of nature. It's too much deep for that. It seems instead to be a trap dug by a demon. I'm not sure how long it would be before it finds me. One of my legs are broken and the other has badly been wounded by that beast. I can't get out. The skin around the bite wound is beginning to turn gray, and I feel sick as a dog. Mom, if you find this, I love you. And also, run.
When you lose a child, the therapists say all kinds of things about the grieving process. They'll search for any reason to blame yourself. You'll play the last moments in your head on repeat. You'll go numb for months on end. But there's one thing my grief counselor never told me. She never said anything about the noise. None of the books talked about it either. The giggles and coughs and creaking of doors, the bouncing of cupboards and the clinking of toys, are the sounds a child fills a home with, vanish in a breath. The silence that remains bear down you like smoke. It suffocates you. Sometimes it kills you. And then, one day, as you drift like a wrath down the empty halls of your home, a sound rings out in the quiet. Sometimes it's a sniffle. Sometimes it's a little footstep. Your brain dismisses the noise because it's so familiar, so commonplace. Then, reality catches up and reminds you that your child is gone. I was in bed the first time it happened. A faint yawn stirred me up from my sleep. I ignored it and rolled over, knowing it was just Sophie in her room nearby. A few seconds later, I jolted upright, trying to remember if the hell I'd been living was all a dream. Trying to remember if my daughter was really just down the hall. It doesn't matter how much time passes. I always hear the noises, and the realization is always the same. Sophie is gone, and she's never coming back. Some part of my brain just can't let her go, and fills the vacuum of her absence with fleeting signs of life. I've been trapped in this house with a head full of ghosts for half a year now. At first, I heard the noises only as I went about my day, but as soon as they began to spill into my dreams, I'd sometimes be woken up by her laughter or by my own cries as I tore through the woods in search of her. With the passage of time, I began dreaming of something worse. It's not the one where I find out she ran away on purpose, or the one where the cops tell me they found a dead body. It's darker, more sinister. Something comes out of the woods towards my house. It comes at night and looks up at the windows. I always know what it wants. In some dreams, it stands outside my daughter's room and calls to her in a raspy voice. I watch her open the window and vanish into the freezing dark. I never actually see the thing. I always scream myself awake the moment it turns to look at me. I'm afraid to sleep. I spend almost no time in my bedroom. Instead, I try to nap in the living room with music playing, or I try to get work done in the downstairs office. Then, a week ago, I heard it while I was awake. A strange noise somewhere outside. It crackled like a branch snapping or fence breaking. I grabbed a flashlight and my father's old car and stepped out into the cold. My property spans a few acres, and the far end of the yard backs up against thick woods. A while back, an old couple driving home from church claimed they'd seen a girl matching Sophie's description. They saw her walking towards the forest, but nothing ever turned up. I circled my house, but I couldn't locate the source of the noises. It happened again for 3 consecutive nights. On the last, I was ready for it. I threw the back door open the moment the crackling arose. There, at the edge of the woods, something lurched between the trees and receded into the darkness. Sleep barely came at all after that. My mind kept tying the wicked dreams to what was happening outside, and soon I came to believe that whoever or whatever was visiting my home wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Last night, my visitor returned. I watched it from the window in the upstairs hall. I saw it emerge from the murky woods and move across the field beneath a pale moon. The thing didn't walk with the familiar rhythm of a biped. Instead, it skittered, transferring its weight fluidly from the indiscernible limb to another, or occasionally rolling and diving like tumbleweed. All the while, its pallid head bobbed around on a contorted neck, studying everything, or nothing at all. The creature made its way around my house, touching and tapping and scratching on doors and windows, looking for a way in. I scrambled for the knife, and just as I did, there was a knock on the front door. It was a polite but purposeful knock, and had I not seen the hideous thing outside moments before, I'd have been certain it was a neighbor checking in on me. I stood there at the top of the stairs in the darkness of my home, gazing down at the front door as the knocks repeated in threes. My body went stiff, and the longer I froze there, the more intense the knocking grew. Soon, the thing outside pounded and scratched at my door with such force that the dreadful sounds echoed through every inch of the house. The creature issued desperate groans and rattled the knob, swelling with rage each passing moment. At last, I regained control of myself and snuck down the stairs, crowbar in hand, ready to shred this thing to bits if it came inside. The old door reached the end of its integrity and split apart, revealing a sight so gruesome I nearly vomited. My eyes perceived the being's parts, but my brain couldn't compose them into a familiar object. Snarls of rooted wood and bone, hanging scraps of flesh, ropes and a vine and stick, red muscle that twitched and rippled as a monster breached my entryway. The hulking mass rushed towards me, wet feet slapping the hardwood floor and leaving trails of soil and blood. I tried to scream as the thing seized me up in its grip and studied me. I tried to slice at it, but it clamped down on my arm with breathtaking strength. It yanked me close to its dry and shallow face, and I imagined the head might have been stolen from a near fresh corpse. The thing peered down into my soul with lidless eyes that screamed in terror, as if witnessing to something even more ghastly than itself. It mumbled something to me, something wet and guttural, and my gaze fell on the crown jewel of its horrors. A set of ragged, gory lips stretched over 100 mismatched teeth. What looked like fishing lines snaked its way throughout the maw, sewn with cruel hands. Pulled taut to imprison the face in an eternal grimace. The room went sideways and my back slammed against the floor. The ceiling flew past and gave way to a starry sky. Wet grass licked my skin. My screams filled the night air and reverberated all around me. I hacked and slashed at its putrid hand, but the creature never stopped dragging me towards the woods. I knew death awaited, and soon the shadows swallowed me up. Pitiful groans echoed in the forest all around me, but they weren't mine. They came from a man in terrible pain, and the image of a half-eaten person crawling around the leaves appeared in my mind's eye. I was probably next. The moans grew louder and louder until finally my captor snatched me off of the ground and stood me upright, gripping my head in its scrawled hands to show me something. A naked man, near dead, bound to a tree with a net of roots and vines. "Mark," I said in disbelief. I knew this man. He lived a few miles up the road, and we always ran into each other down at the general store. He even knew my kid. "Oh God," he sobbed. He wasn't relieved to see me. In fact, he hid his eyes as much as he could. Mark had taken a brutal beating. Purple and black welts covered his face, and lacerations in varying depth crisscrossed his body. Dried blood caked his form like war paint. Who knows how long he'd been held captive. The creature pressed its rotten face against my ear and mumbled something indecipherable. It let me go and lurched towards the wounded man, growling through its jagged teeth. Mark wailed for mercy, but the creature would give him none. It grabbed his throat and squeezed until Mark's eye bulged wide open, and then it pointed a long, crooked finger in my direction. "Yes," Mark cried, between shallow breaths. "Yes, okay, it was me. It was me, Felix." The creature watched me, awaiting my reaction, but Mark's words locked me down as tightly as the roots that held him. Memories of my daughter flooded my thoughts like a drug, fast and warm, taking my mind far away from the gloomy woods we stood in. "I told her to follow me," he continued. I tricked her. I'm sick, Felix. I've been messed up so long, 'cause of my old man. I can feel him in me, making me ugly." The image of little Sophie laughing and playing and holding my hand sped up. They drifted by faster and faster until they all blurred into each other, from the day she was born through saying goodbye to her mom in the hospital to the last time I saw her get on the school bus at the end of the road. My mind raced over the memory of me arriving just a few minutes late that evening. The bus was already gone, and so was my daughter. A long moment passed. The creature never tore its dead gaze from me. Then, the only words I could find came slinging out of my mouth in a meek whisper. "She trusted you." Hearing those words out loud ignited hellfire inside me. My reason evaporated and inevitable hatred settled over me like a fog that snaked between the trees. I charged at Mark, Kabar in death grip. I wanted to bury it in the mouth he spoke to my child with. But before I could reach him, the creature intercepted me and stopped me dead in my tracks. It pried the knife from my hand and flung it into the woods. It peered into my eyes. I stared into a face transformed by death, and yet I could see it come alive with sorrow. It looked as revolted as I felt. What this being knew of human ethics was insurmountable, but it seemed to understand the situation in a natural context. The man was a predator, and my little girl was a prey. And it seemed to detect that this sort of hunting was not the normal order of things. The man wasn't hunting to eat, but rather to satiate a darker sort of hunger. The creature released me and pointed to a nearby tree. At its base lay a white bedsheet, likely taken from the clothesline of a nearby farmhouse. My eyes moved over to the contours of its surface, tracing the gentle features of a child's body. My heart collapsed into a black hole. My chest nearly caved in with it. At this time, I had said it worse to have a missing child dead. All this time, I had said it worse to have a missing child than a dead one, because in death at least you have an answer. But the moment Sophie's shape registered in my head, I'd have been given anything for her to go back to being a question mark. The creature pointed back the way we had come, back to my home. Then it reached up to its horrid face. It tore at the wire that had sealed its mouth and snarled when the ragged lips came free. It returned to Mark and grabbed his throat, as it had before, but this time it thrust its face against his. Horrified shrieks rang out in the woods, followed by the sickening sounds of flesh splitting away. It looked back at me, gagging on the tongue it had just stolen from the man, until finally the appendage slipped into place. The creature then said, "Leave." I ignored the lightning bolts of pain that arched between my head and chest, and scooped up Sophie's remains, bedsheet swaddling her in tiny form. Mark's house followed me to the edge of the woods, then cut out abruptly as I stepped into the field. The walk home was a solemn one, guided by the fire of a crescent sun. I broke ground just beneath my bedroom window when dug into the daylight reached the western hills. By the time I patted the last heap of dirt into the Sophie's resting place, the shadows had vanished from the edge of the woods. Spar one. It loomed for just a while, then receded, never to darken my field again. In time, the sounds that had once haunted me receded too, and I could finally grieve in peace. I never met my grandfather, though I lived with him for a few weeks. By the time we moved in with him, he was already ill, far too ill to entertain visits from little girls, according to my mom. "You're not going to his room," she said, raising her eyes to meet mine in the rearview mirror. "You hear me, Ellie?" I nodded, but she continued to stare at me until I mumbled, "I promise, Mom." She held my gaze for a moment longer before looking away, turning her attention to our new home. To a born-and-bred city kid, it looked like something out of a picture book. The red brick cottage was the only house for miles around, but even in the rows of houses, it would have stood out for its door and window frames painted a cherry shade of green. Even from a distance, I could see white-winged butterflies fluttering around the honeysuckle that climbed its walls. I couldn't understand why Mom had ever left this place for our dairy 2 up, 2 down, much less why she seemed hesitant to return. We sat in the car for 5 minutes, then 10, and still she showed no signs of moving. It was mid-July, and soon it grew hot enough that I sweated through my shirt. Although I shifted in my seat, grumbling, she ignored me. Finally, my Uncle Tim, sitting next to her in the passenger seat, said, "We have to go in sooner or later, Chelly." "I have to," said Mom, quietly enough that I had to strain to hear her. "You can still walk away." He grabbed one of her hands, which had been drumming against the steering wheel, and gave a squeeze. "Not on your life." She offered him a weak smile in return before flicking a glance in my direction. "Can you?" "No problem." We piled out of the car, Mom in the lead as we headed up the garden path. She disappeared through the front door, but before I could follow her, Tim grasped my shoulders. "Come on, kiddo," he said, steering me away. "I've got something to show you." He led me around the back of the house and deeper into the garden, until we came to a ramshackle old shed. A rusted padlock held the door shut. After a few minutes of poking through the nearby shrubbery, Tim emerged with a trumpet grin and a key in his hand. "This place used to be ours. Mine and your mom's, that is," he said as he opened the door. "Now, it's yours." I didn't think too much of this gift, if that's what it was meant to be. The place looked like a stiff breeze would knock it over, and full of spiders to boot. Why would I want to spend time there when there was a cottage that looked like it would be at least in the Sherry only a few away? As I took my first flattering step inside, though, I saw that the shed contained hidden treasures. A makeshift tent constructed of what appeared to be a pair of faded velvet drapes had been erected at its center, and around it lay artifacts of my mother's childhood. There were a dozen of old board games, one of which seemed to have been abandoned mid-play, a pair of dirt-encrusted roller skates, faded comic books, and a small army of porcelain cats, all chipped and missing tails or ears. Best of all was a pile of books, with no siblings to play with, or even other kids my age on the street where I'd grown up. I'd become a bookworm. Every Christmas and birthday bought me a new book, but I devoured them quickly, and I knew my small library so well I could quote every volume. Finding new reading material was like stumbling onto a gold mine. Tim chuckled as I seized the first book within reach, plonked myself on the dusty floor, and began to read. You like it here then? I love it. I glanced up, despair and a grin. Thank you. Good. He smiled and thrust his hands into his pockets, looking around at his old haunt. We can make it a bit more homely for you. Bring in some lights, maybe even a portable television. He crouched in front of me, tugging the book away to ensure he had my attention. It's not going to be very nice up at the house for a while, what with your granddad being ill. Your mom's going to have a hard time of it. It might be best for you to stay out under her feet. I murmured in agreement, but I didn't need his warning. Mom had been snappy and irritable since she got the phone call saying Granddad was ill, scolding me for the least infraction, sometimes just for being in the same room as her. I'd taken to staying out of her way as much as I could. Once he was certain I understood, Tim left and went up to the house. He returned a few hours later with the lights he had promised, along with clean blankets and pillows and a bucket of cleaning supplies. Together, we worked to remove the worst of the dirt and cobwebs. By the time we finished, the shed was quite cozy. The place became my home for the summer. When I wasn't reading or inventing dramatic ways to stage the porcelain cats, I was out exploring the garden. It was there that I met a real cat, a Ginger Tom, who I swiftly named Marbling. After some persuading with my ham sandwiches, he decided he liked my company well enough and claimed the plumpless cushion in the shed as his bed. He'll be full of fleas, Mom grumbled when I introduced her to him. If he's planning on sticking around, he'll need a bath. I agreed, but Marbling wasn't so amenable. As soon as Mom tried to carry him into the house, he began hissing and kicking, opening several deep cuts along her arms. After clawing himself free, he retreated to a high shelf in the shed, and no amount of cajoling or bribery would persuade him down. Fine, snarled Mom, glowering up at him. Don't come howling at me when you're bitten half to death. As for myself, I only entered the house to use the bathroom or eat, although more often than not, Mom or Tim would bring me a plate down to the shed for me. When I did have to go inside, I got in and out as quickly as possible. It hadn't taken me long to discover that, as cheerful as the exterior was, a thick gloom lay over the house. The summer heat never seemed to penetrate its walls, and it was pervaded by a silence so heavy I was afraid to break it. As I walked through the corridors, wincing at each thundering footstep, I couldn't forget that somewhere above my head, my unknown grandfather lay dying. Part of me was curious to meet him, but another, much larger part, was too scared of his sickness and my mother's grief. I thought I saw him once, one evening around the sunset. As I was leaving the bathroom, I caught movement at the far end of the corridor. I leaned forward, squinting. I noticed that the shadows here had a peculiar density, particularly as the sun went down, and I wasn't sure whether my eyes were playing tricks on me. Although I spotted no more movement, a patch of shadows was darker than the rest, and I had the unshakable feeling of being watched. I knew it wasn't Mom or Tim. They were both quick to shoo me out of the house when they spotted me indoors. "Granddad?" I whispered. A moment of silence, and then there came a low, rattling exhale that sent a prickle of goosebumps along my arms. As young as I was, I knew that no one could breathe like that and still live. It sounded as though they were drowning on dry land. I knew I should have helped my granddad back to bed, or at the very least call for my mom, but that breath was too much for me. Throwing my hands over my eyes, I ran for the door and didn't stop until I had reached the safety of my shed. Once I had calmed down, I was overwhelmed by a burning shame. I had run from an old, dying man without a second thought. The books were waiting for me though, and it wasn't easy enough to lose myself in one of them. By the time I fell asleep, I'd all but forgotten about the incident, and didn't think about my granddad again until I saw them carrying his coffin out of the house. I expected his death to spell the end of my time in the shed, that Mom and Tim would insist on me moving into the house now that he passed. The funeral came and went, and they made no mention of it. I kept quiet. I had transformed the shed into my own little realm, and had no desire to leave it. Shortly after, I began attending the local school, and neither of them complained about our living arrangements. It was only the arrival of autumn and the first of the cold weather that forced the issue. "We'd love for you to stay out there," said Tim gently as he helped me move my things into one of the bedrooms, "but you'll catch your death of cold." I nodded, fighting back an unexpected wave of tears. I knew he was right. The last few mornings I'd woken up with toes so cold that they'd hurt. Still, I'd miss what had been my home for the last few weeks, and worst of all, I'd spend less time with Marmalade. I'd grown used to his warm little body curled up against mine at night, but he still refused to enter the house. In the event, the house provided more protection against the cold. I spent my first night in my new bed shivering around a hot water bottle, slipping in and out of an uneasy sleep. The next day, I yawned my way through school, hoping that exhaustion would at least guarantee me a good sleep that night. Despite my hopes, I fared no better the second night than on the first. I kept my bedside lamp on, for its glow provided at least a semblance of warmth. Or so I told myself. Now that I was back here, there was no pretending that I had imagined a strange quality of shadows. When I turned the light off, the darkness seemed to press in on me, making it difficult to draw a breath. Even when the light was on, I was revisited by the feeling of being watched. Several times each night, I would clamber out of my bed and do a circuit around the room, sweeping my arms beneath the bed, pulling my clothes aside in the wardrobe and peering out of the window. I performed all these late night searches trembling and sweating, the latter in spite of the cold. I desperately wanted to wake Mom and ask her to look for me, but her mood had sunk even lower since Granddad's death, and I was scared of waking her. I never found any signs of an intruder, yet each time I was on the verge of sleep, I would snap back to wakefulness, certain someone was nearby. This continued for a week, until my body could no longer bear the strain. I crawled into bed that night and within seconds had lapsed into the state of being sleeping and waking where dreams and reality are all but distinguishable. And as my awareness ebbed and flowed, the light winked out. I couldn't move. I couldn't open my eyes. I didn't need to. I could feel the darkness pressing down on me. It swelled around my throat, rushing up my face and sweeping into my mouth, my nose. It clogged my airways, choking my breath. The pressure on my lungs became unbearable. Just when I thought I must breathe or die, two things happened at once. There came a great, rattling breath, both inside my body and out of it. just like I'd heard that evening before my granddad had died. It was met by yowling and a searing pain across my chest. The choking presence retreated. My paralysis was broken. I fumbled through the defeating darkness, barely hearing the inhuman shrieks that bounced around the room, desperate for light. Finally, my trembling fingers found the lamp. As light flooded the room, silence fell. At the bottom of the bed, I saw Marbeline, my sweet, brave cat, limp but breathing. Scooping him up in my arms, I fled the house. Only when I reached the shed and slammed the door shut behind me, I did give way to tears. They came as heaving sobs rasping out of a tender throat. Mom and Tim appeared soon after. "I'm not going back in there." I tried to shout, but it emerged as a croak. "I won't do it. You can't make me." They exchanged an unbreakable look before Tim turned and, without a word, went back to the house. Mom gathered me in her arms, murmuring soothing nonsense against the top of my head. I was terrified that she would ask me what happened, but that she wouldn't believe me. But she had held me. Tim reappeared with an armful of thick blankets, which he fastened into a bed on the floor. "This will do for night," he said. "We'll get you something more permanent tomorrow." They stayed with me until I fell asleep, and were gone by the time I woke next morning. True to his word, Tim went into the nearby town and bought me a heavy-duty sleeping bag. It didn't quite keep the chill out, but anything was better than sleeping in that house. Nothing was ever said about that night. No questions asked about why I had fled and refused to return. That didn't sit right with me. Before we had came to this place, Mom had been attentive. Every night she would ask me about school, who I had eaten lunch with, what subject I had enjoyed the most that day. She was at every parent's evening, quizzing the teachers about the smallest detail on my latest report. That she would not ask a single question about what had sent me screaming from the house didn't just seem wrong. In the sanctuary of my shed, the memory of that light became little more than a bad dream. My one source of misery was Marbeline. Although he had physically recovered from whatever happened in the dark, he wasn't the same cat. He no longer waited at the gate for me to return from school, ready to butt his head against my legs. He no longer seemed interested in me at all, approaching only to snatch scraps of food before retreating to prowl the boundary of garden. A few days after I returned to the shed, I found him next to the gate, lifeless. Blood had trickled from his ears and eyes, staining his bright orange fur a rusty brown. After Mom and Tim buried him in the garden, they came to my shed to comfort me as I cried. Eventually, I sobbed myself to sleep. By the time I woke, darkness had fallen and Mom and Tim were talking in low voices. "We need something stronger," said Mom. "That's if we're right at all," murmured Tim. "There's only one way to find out. Besides, what choice do we have?" I heard shifting, then gentle fingers brushed across my forehead. "Should we really be discussing this right here?" Mom laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Would you rather discuss it in there?" There followed a silence that lasted so long I began to drift back to sleep. By the time Tim spoke again, I could no longer be sure whether I was awake or dreaming. "Okay," he said. "Let's try." I'm a 20-year-old fresh out of college, working the check-in desk at my local gym. Turns out a communications degree might not be as useful as I was led to believe, since all I can get is this job that doesn't even require an education.
I do, however, earn slightly more than minimum wage, so there's that. Suck it, dropouts. If you're wondering which gym I work at, I'm not gonna say. It's a part of a chain with a big enough name that chances are you've heard it before. I don't want to draw unnecessary attention. I'm writing this because some stuff has been happening during my night shifts, stuff that I can't explain. At first, the job wasn't so bad. Most of what I do involves sitting at the desk and checking in memories. Occasionally, I'll have to clean some equipment or refill hand sanitizer bottles, but it's pretty laid-back shift. There are a few members to keep an eye on between the hours of 8 and 11, but the closer you get to midnight, you start seeing less and less people showing up to exercise. 12 to 3 is usually dead empty. I use that free time to read most nights. I've been working my way through a fat stack of books that I've had for years, but never got around to reading. Game of Thrones is actually pretty good. Who knew? The first few nights, I wasn't left to work alone. My supervisor is a guy named Connor, maybe 30 or 31 years old. I'm not so good with ages. He's been working here for a few years now. He showed me the ropes of first couple of shifts. Connor's easy enough to get along with when we work together. I think he just wants to make it through the night so that he can get home and play some Call of Duty with his friends. He's not the type to boss me around or make things difficult, but he did warn me that I might see some strange things if I worked late night. Just do your job. Ignore anything weird you see, and you'll be fine, he told me on my first shift. As long as no one thrashes the place, don't interrupt them. The people who come in late, who come at 2 or 3 in the morning, they already lead unconventional lives. If they're a bit weird, that's just the kind of people they are. Don't question anybody. People only want to work out. Don't question anyone. Got it. And don't forget that first part too. Ignore anything weird you might see. Weird? Like people damaging the equipment? No, if you see that, call this number. Connor taped a phone number on the laminated sheet on the desk. And you check their faces with the info registered on the file. That's a member who won't be a member much longer. Then, like what? I asked, genuinely curious. What weird stuff do you mean? Connor heaved a great sigh, as though he wishes he were having any conversation but this one. Listen, you've never worked a grave shift before. I shook my head. Well, it's easy to think you're seeing things, especially here, he said, and gestured to the mostly empty gym. Odd as it may seem, graveyard shifts can make even the most sane guy nervous, jumpy. Heck, even I've seen things I can explain. You'll do fine though. Everyone does. Just ignore anything you see or hear, or anything you think you see or hear. If you do that, everything will be fine. To hammer the point home, he even scribbled a reminder in Sharpie on a sticky note. Just ignore it, the note commanded, and he stuck it on the side of the computer monitor at the desk. Connor's advice seemed helpful at first, but when I got used to the job and he started letting me take the night shifts alone, I realized it. It was more than helpful. It was necessary. The members aren't what bothers me, although we've got a few weirdos who come in at oddly specific times every week. It's the things that I see when no one else is around that bothers me. One time, while sitting in my desk reading, I felt an uncomfortable tension in the air. I don't know why I noticed it. It was as if, just then, someone had entered the gym, but the floor was empty. I felt a presence creeping into my consciousness. Very slowly, I swept my gaze across the surroundings, seeing nothing, just before I ignored it, waving it all off as a late-night jitters. I saw something I can't explain. I saw the bar or one of the pull-down machines trembling in the air, a huge number of weights strung up on the machine, as though someone were sitting there exercising. The bar was hanging, quivering in space, empty space. The moment I noticed it, the bar went sailing back upward, and the weights fell back down with a resounding crash. I would have fled the gym then and there if I weren't paralyzed with fear. And then there was a sticky note Connor had left me to. Just ignore it, as that conversation replayed in my head. I wondered if this were the sort of thing he might have been talking about. A workout equipment moving on its own? I bit my tongue so hard it bled, and I pressed down my fear deep down into my shoes and socks until my paralysis was overcome. And I ignored it. I went back to my reading as if nothing had happened at all. Still, the next time I came in for a shift, I went over to look at the machines that had dropped all those weights. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Every now and then I hear a crash of unexplainable weights. Sometimes it even happens when there are late night memories exercising, but no one ever seems to know who caused it. They'll look around and shrug and go back to their exercise. But I've seen the bar lower on its own. I know what they don't. Other explainable things have been happening. There's an elliptical machine in the corner that sometimes comes awake if I'm not looking. It's silent, as silent can be. Some of the other machines squeak and moan, but you know right away if they're moving. But this one just glides along quiet, as a mouse. If you didn't know to look, you wouldn't be able to tell if it were moving. That's how quiet it is. If I do look at it though, it will come to a gentle stop, but as soon as I turn my attention back to my books, it'll start up again. I can sometimes see a glimpse of something move in the mirrors, of those pedals pumping up and down. It gives me such unbearable creeps. I really hate that machine. As bad as all that stuff is, none of it holds a candle to the shower man. I don't know what he is, who he is, or what he wants, or if he's in any way connected to the other stuff that's been going on here. The shower man never appears if someone else is there with me. Whenever it's a coworker or a member using the gym's facilities, only when I'm totally alone, and even then, not too often. When he arrives, the light over the bathroom door will flicker, and I'll hear the shower water start running, even though no one is there. Can you imagine what it's like to be sitting in a gym completely alone at 3 in the morning? With the fluorescent lights on overhead and the radio's music quiet in the background, with the blackest screens of night fogging just beyond the great glass windows, barely concealed by the equipment's reflection in the screen. If you can imagine that, then you know it's not a great headspace for anything out of the ordinary to happen. The first time I saw those bathroom lights flicker, my entire being snapped to attention. I was petrified. Worse than the flickering of lights, worse than the noise of the shower turning on, worse than anything I'd encountered yet, was the sound of the shower man's humming. It's not that there was anything particular out of the ordinary about it. It's not that there was anything outwardly frightening about the tunes themselves. Just the idea of being alone and suddenly hearing a human voice where no voice should be. Could have been a member I hadn't realized was exercising. And no, I would have seen anyone coming in. I double-checked the roster of members on the computer, just in case, but I was right. It was 2:49 a.m. and there was nobody checked in. I had to steel myself to investigate. I only took one look at Connor's note and just ignored it before I snatched it off the side of the monitor and made my way towards the bathroom. In hindsight, it sounds counterintuitive. In the moment, I needed to prove to myself that I was hearing something. Otherwise, I would have lost my nerve entirely and left, and very likely never returned. As quietly as possible, I edged open the door. All the lights in the bathroom were off. Through the pitch of black air, I could hear the sounds of wet feet on the tile, and the sounds of scrubbing, of torrents of water, and of a low, throated humming. All around me was sticky, wet steam in the dark. It took all my courage to confront the intruder. to flip on the lights and announce loudly, "Who's there?" But as soon as I turned the lights on, the water stopped burning with a loud splatter. Steam billowed outwards, and the shower man was gone. I heard water spiral down the drain, but I didn't pull the curtain. I was too afraid of what I might see. An unusual smell lingered in the air too, but I couldn't quite place it. It should have been enough to make me quit, but when I consciously broached the subject with Connor, he just shook his head and shut me up instantly. No, I don't want to hear about it," he said. "Whatever you've seen is just for you. Don't get me involved." But no buts. Every one of us have seen strange things, get it? You remember what I told you, don't you? Ignore it. It won't do any good to bring anyone else into it. At least all of me. Whatever you've been seeing, just be glad it's not intrusive and leave that to that. Over the next few months, the shower man came to visit more and more regularly. He still does, but always when I'm alone. If someone else is there, I'll never see him. I've become intrigued by his presence, especially since nothing outwardly bad has happened yet. As long as I don't turn on the lights or make any noise, I can stay in the bathroom while he cleans. I can still listen to him humming, listen to his wet feet slapping in the suds. Knowing that there is someone or something else in the dark is a terrible feeling. I don't know how I'm supposed to stop, to ignore a presence like that. Part of me wants to catch a glimpse of him, and a part of me is terrified of what I might see. I've only done that twice, sat there to listen to him, that is. The rest time, I got so scared after a few minutes that I crept back out and went to my desk, waiting quietly until I heard the shower stop, the curtain open, and wet feet walk away into nowhere. The second time, the water stopped while I was still in it with him. The humming stopped with the water, and then I heard the curtain slide open, the ringlets juddering on the pole, and some vast and terrible presence stepped out of the stall into the dark steam beside me. Even with my eyes adjusted to the dark, I could barely see, but I swear, whatever stepped out of that shower must have been at least 8 feet tall. I've never ran away so fast in my life. Now, I keep working. I need the money, but I ignore the shower man, just as I ignore the other strange bumps in the night. And just as I ignore the weirdo gym members who only work out at 3 a.m. It's the same to me. As long as I don't interrupt them, they don't interrupt me. The other morning, though, I heard the shower man just as I was getting ready to leave. It was nearly 4 in the morning, and Rita, who has a shift right after mine, came in the door. As she did, the shower water stopped. He doesn't like to be interrupted after all. I said good morning to Rita and got my things preparing to leave, but before I went, I stopped to use the bathroom. Normally I'd have to be nervous, especially knowing the shower man had been in there for only a few moments before. But Rita was there. Nothing sinister happened while another living person was inside the building. I could count on that if I could count on anything, and so I wasn't concerned. Except that particular morning, something strange did happen. I could smell an unusual tang in the air, something different from the faintly sweat, faintly soaping mix that normally pervades in the bathroom air. Something iron and sharp. I had smelled it once before, the first time that I'd interrupted the shower man, and I recognized that scent right away. I bypassed the toilets and crept straight toward the shower stalls, where one still stood with the curtain closed. The shower man's ritual having been so swiftly interrupted by Rita's arrival, I pulled the curtain aside and nearly fainted. The walls of the shower stall were crimson. The curtain was covered and dripping. Scarlet runnels pulled down through the grout and spun away into the drain. And that iron stench rose up in red tiles like a fist to smack me in my face. The stall had been drenched and gallons of human blood.
I hope you guys enjoyed today's stories. Thank you so much for listening. And a huge thanks to all the Redditors that participated in today's stories, and thank you so much for granting me permission to narrate them. I appreciate it so much. Now, this video consists of various stories on this channel that were already uploaded, so like old stories that never gained recognition. So this is a re-uploaded version of those stories, re-edited and re-recorded and stuff like that. So yeah, once more, I hope you guys enjoyed today's stories, and I'll see you guys in the next video. So don't forget to sit back, relax, and indulge in fear.